There's an app for that. Wait, hold on! I'm Steve Jobs! Come on, no, stop it!
It was a phrase so ubiquitous in the early days of the smartphone craze that it's hard to believe Apple actually has trademarked. It was a testament to a simple and immutable truth about the world these new touchscreen phones were creating. No matter how strange and obscure the need, there would be an app to fulfill it. Perhaps you remember iBeer, the app that allowed you to pretend you were drinking a tall glass of beer, for some reason. There was Car Matey, an app that reminded you where you parked your car, in a pirate voice. And who could forget I Am Bread, a surreal game about controlling a sentient slice of bread on a quest to become toast. But there's one app out there somewhere on the market that you probably didn't download. And if you did, well, you have our sincerest apologies. Because even seeing this video pop out onto your feed probably sent a chill down your spine. Well, if that chill ever even left. Take it from one gentleman whose life took a very strange turn after downloading a certain app that the SCP Foundation calls SCP-1471. Because the sentiment, "there's an app for that," doesn't exclude experiencing mortal terror. Joe Lillis, an insurance salesman from Milwaukee, had just gone through another atrocious date. After a mediocre meal and an uncomfortable 35 minutes of inane babble, sensing the whole time that she really wasn't that interested, his date excused himself to take a quick phone call outside. Sadly for Joe, she never returned, leaving him to pick up the check. Of all the many words you could use to describe poor Joe Lillis, the most pertinent would be lonely. Ever since Carol, his wife of 10 years, had passed away in a freak accident, he'd been trying to find some kind of way to fill the void. They'd been high school sweethearts, intent on spending the rest of their lives with one another. As fate would have it, only Carol would get that tainted luxury. Joe would be forced to endure life after the joy of living had run its course. He only hoped he might be lucky enough to find love again. However, Joe was on the wrong side of 40, and as so many others his age were already hitched, he could feel his options going out one by one. Would he be destined to live out the rest of his days alone? Joe didn't feel like spending the back half of his life catching reruns of Seinfeld and tending to his fish. He needed to get out there. And thankfully, like the rest of us, he lived in the internet age. He had more apps, websites, online services, and hot Russian singles in his area than he knew what to do with. So surely one would have the right person for him. He tried them all. Tinder, Hinge, Match.com, Plenty of Fish, eHarmony, Bumble, Zoosk, OkCupid, Friend Finder, Deeply Lonely Singles with Low Expectations.com, and so much more. However, all it seemed to achieve was setting him up for more disappointment. None of the dates he'd managed to get ever resulted in anything getting serious. Heck, it was a minor miracle if he even managed to get any of them on a second date. Was this it? Was this his life now? Had he only ever gotten one shot at love, and the grasping claws of fate yanked it away from him without a second thought? Would life continue on the hamster wheel of loneliness? Sleeping, getting up, eating, working, and sleeping again? Every day getting somehow both faster and slower as life trudged on to a disappointing yet inevitable conclusion? What a terrible fate to find yourself trapped in. Whenever Joe started feeling maudlin like this, he knew it was time to get proactive again. Maybe the right woman was out there. There were billions of them, after all. Surely at least one of them would be the perfect person for him. He just needed the perfect app. He'd burned through all of the most reputable apps already, and was now perusing some of the slightly seedier options, most of which were likely data mining fronts from the Balkans. However, as generic app after generic app passed, something different caught his eye. The icon was a smiling cartoon dog, and its name was MalO version 1.0.0. This gave him a little chuckle. At the very least, it was very different branding from the rest of the dating apps he'd seen. Maybe it'd just been sorted into the wrong section of the App Store. He decided he'd check it out and take a look at the app's description. The description read, "Never settle for those awkward feelings of being alone ever again. MalO is an exciting and interactive experience that will keep you engaged and intrigued. The anxiety of social situations can be nerve-wracking, but after just a few hours of MalO, you will soon forget all about those painful emotions of disappointment. Be part of the new craze that is quickly becoming the next social substitute. Remember, the more you participate, the more MalO will engage you. Your experience is completely up to you. Absolutely no ads. Enjoy. Well, it certainly provoked Joe's curiosity at the very least. He did want to banish his feelings of loneliness, and seeing as the app was free and apparently had no ads, he'd surely be foolish to not at least give it a whirl. What's the worst that could happen? He began the installation, and only then noticed that the app had no listed developer. It took up 9.8 megabytes of memory, which he wasn't tech-savvy enough to see any issues with. More than anything, Joe was just enticed by the prospect of finally having another chance at companionship with MalO. After all, it is the next social substitute, whatever that means. However, Joe's excitement was quickly quashed when he hit the home screen button and noticed that the icon for the app never actually materialized. Strange. He checked the App Store portal again and saw that, according to them, the app had completely downloaded. What gives? Was it a glitch, or was MalO actually just malware? Either way, he was disheartened by the fact that this immaterial app certainly wouldn't be getting him any companionship. Or so he thought, anyway. Joe was used to disappointment by now, so he didn't take it too personally. He decided to just play out the rest of his evening on autopilot, making himself some soup, doing the laundry, watching more Seinfeld reruns, taking a cold shower, and preparing to cry himself to sleep again. MalO was already becoming a distant memory, just like all the deceptive sources of hope. But one strange thing happened that disrupted Joe's finely tuned evening routine. He received a text message. This was incredibly strange because nobody ever seemed to text him. The last text he got was from Carol just before her accident, so it was almost surreal to hear that alert sound now, after everything that happened. He checked and saw that the text was an image attachment sent from an unknown number. Perplexed yet curious, he decided to open it. His curiosity soon gave way to a kind of melancholy nostalgia when he saw that the photo was of his and Carol's favorite cafe in town. They'd spent many a morning there, back when she was alive, treating themselves to a nice cup of coffee and perhaps a croissant. Just seeing it again caused an involuntary smile to spread across his face. It never even occurred to him, as it probably would have to others, that this could be seen as a little creepy. He hadn't frequented the bakery since Carol died. How would anyone even know that this place held any significance for him? Was it a stalker, a ghost, or just a spooky coincidence? None of these thoughts even crossed Joe's mind. He was just grateful for the surprising reminder of the happiness he'd once had. For the next couple hours, things seemed lighter. He went about his evening, checking the photo every so often and smiling, until eventually he found himself in bed, still looking into the glow of his phone. It was such a beautiful little cafe. Then he froze. He noticed something in the picture. It'd been there the whole time, but only now he was seeing rather than just looking. It was in the corner, staring through the glass of the cafe's door. So faint he almost wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the light. It was a face. Well, not a face, more like a skull. Not a human, not anywhere near human. Long, slender, and canine, with protruding fangs and vacant white eyes. The pure white of the skull was buried in a nest of thick black hair. It looked like it was crouching behind the door, looking out and grinning, whatever the hell it was. Just seeing it changed the entire tone of the picture. It was no longer a simple reminder of bygone joy. Now all that was radiating out of that image was a palpable sense of dread. Was someone playing some kind of awful prank on him? Just then he was jogged from his contemplation by another alert. A new message from the same number as before. With great hesitation, he hovered his thumb over the push notification and clicked. That's when everything got a lot worse. It was a photo of a bus stop. Not just any bus stop, of course. It was stop C16, the one that Joe always took to get to work. It looked like it was taken relatively early in the morning, but nobody was there. Well, not quite nobody. There was that figure again. It stood at full height, behind the partially frosted glass that makes up the back of the bus stop. The same large black humanoid shape, with a white, grinning dog skull where the face should be. Something about it terrified him on such a primal level, like the way our lizard brain reacts to some ancient apex predator. And whatever this thing was, it clearly knew something about him. How else could it stage all these photos? Joe got out of bed and looked out of the window, down onto his dark front street. Empty, thankfully. But after this surprise nightmare, he wasn't going to take any chances. He grabbed a kitchen knife from downstairs and placed it on his bedside cabinet, right next to his phone, with 911 on speed dial. Joe Lillis, a 43-year-old man, slept with the lights on that night for the first time in over 30 years. Sadly for him, the nightmare was just beginning. The next morning, Joe woke up unharmed, but he wasn't pleased to see that he'd gotten several more texts in his sleep. There was one taken outside of the local insurance company office where he worked. The strange creature with the skull for a face was looming around the corner, peering at the camera with its lipless grin, like it was mocking him. Another photo was taken at the local supermarket where Joe did most of his grocery shopping. The frame was centralized on the cereal aisle, bordered on both sides by walls of garish mascots endlessly repeated. Down at the far end of the aisle was a looming dark figure with that cold canine skull where a human face should be. There were a few more, but worst of all was the last one. It was taken at the cemetery. In the foreground, a headstone reading, "Carol Lillis, beloved wife and daughter." Joe was horrified to see that skull-faced beast was rising up behind his wife's grave, long clawed fingers curling around the top of the headstone. That was the moment that Joe decided to go to the police about all of this, before things got even more out of hand. He called an Uber to get down to the station. He certainly didn't feel like he was going anywhere near his regular bus stop after last night. He showed the photos he'd been sent so far to an officer posted at the station, and they agreed that there was certainly something strange about it. While the behavior undeniably bordered on harassment, it hadn't yet delved into criminal territory, so he would sadly be on his own until then. The best they could do was stay in touch and kept abreast of any new developments. The only sage advice they could give him was not to delete the photos, as they could always be used as evidence in court later if things escalated. This was literally the last result that Joe wanted out of this. Considering how bizarre and threatening things were getting already, he really didn't want to find out what escalation looked like in this case. But what else could he do but carry on, just trying to exercise as much caution as he could in these strange new circumstances? He went to work and tried his best to stay productive, despite the fact that every 3 or so hours, a new photo would arrive. Places that he liked to sit in the local parks, stores he'd frequent, restaurants he liked to eat at. The nightmare skeleton dog thing would be standing in all of them, just mugging for the camera. On one hand, every time he looked at one of the photos, Joe felt like he was giving this freak exactly what they wanted. On the other hand, how could he possibly look away? What if he missed something that could save his life? It carried on much like that until later in the evening. Joe may have not been a genius, but he was no fool either. He'd seen too many of those seedy true crime documentaries about kidnapping to take his normal route home. He took a real detour, frequently checking over his shoulder the entire time. Much to his relief, he didn't see anything out of place. Good. When he got home, he locked every door and bolted every window. Nothing would be getting the jump on him tonight. That's when the next picture came in. A photograph of Joe's empty office cubicle, with the bony face of the creature looming over the divider with a grin. He could feel his heart pounding away in his chest just looking at it. How did this thing get around like this? How was it able to infiltrate everywhere in his entire goddamn life? Suddenly, he felt a smile spreading across his face. This freak had just messed up big time. Before, all these creepy photos had been taken in public places, but the one taken in his office? Oh, this crossed the line into trespassing. The police would have to do something about it now. It had given him an ace up his sleeve. That confidence faded a few hours later when he received another photo. This time, it was the skull-faced monster just standing on the sidewalk. The sidewalk that Joe remembered walking on his covert alternative route. He could feel himself break into a cold sweat. It seemed whoever this was, he really did hold no secrets from them. Now more than ever, Joe didn't feel safe in his own home. So you can only imagine how he felt when a few hours later, he received a photo of the skull-faced stalker standing right outside his own front door, staring into the camera. It sent him rushing to the window again to check outside. But of course, nobody was there. The next day when he called the police and updated them on the situation, they told him that they were doing all they could. The best thing he could possibly do was to remain calm, but vigilant. He needed to keep an eye on the photos being sent to him, so he could notify them if ever he was in any immediate danger. This put poor Joe's paranoia at a fever pitch. Even when he went to work, surrounded by his coworkers, by witnesses, he could scarcely tear his eyes away from his phone. He was a slave to the photos, forever waiting for the next one, only to experience crushing regret when the photo actually arrived. It looked like it was taken moments before it was sent to him. Joe saw himself looking at his own phone in his office cubicle, with that huge skull-faced figure looming behind him. He screamed out loud upon seeing it, and turned to see if anything was behind him. But of course, there was nothing there. The police inspected the office, talked to potential witnesses, and analyzed the photo. It showed no signs of any photographic manipulation, but there were also no witnesses around the office who claimed to see anything strange that day. There was also no security camera footage in the last several days that showed this figure coming in or out. Joe Lillis started to feel like he was going insane, and perhaps he was. But that didn't change the tangible and ever-present feeling that he was in great danger. He didn't come into work the next day. He'd received more photos like that in the night, of himself, taken in real time, with that skull-faced freak looming. He didn't want to leave the house. He didn't want to go anywhere anymore. He just didn't feel safe out there. How could he, with all this madness unfolding? There was a time where he could have said something like, "At least it only seems confined to my phone." He might have even suspected that it had something to do with that strange MalO app he downloaded a few days prior that hadn't seemed to do anything. But this situation had evolved since then. He wasn't just seeing the creature in photos anymore. It was here. He kept seeing quick flashes of it on the other side of windows, in reflections, in the corner of his eyes, always darting away if ever he turned towards it. It was everywhere and nowhere. It was here just for him. He just knew. The police couldn't help. Nobody could help. Joe just sat in the corner of his bedroom, clutching his kitchen knife, afraid to close his eyes. It could be anywhere. It could be anywhere. It could be anywhere. We know one thing for sure. Joe Lillis never felt truly alone ever again. He always had his new friend, waiting, just out of sight. And if ever you're feeling lonesome and decide to download MalO version 1.0.0 yourself, then you'll never feel lonely again either. Have you ever seen something you weren't supposed to? Something that made you feel off? Something you regret? Secrets like these are best kept to yourself. But since you're still alive, whatever you saw wasn't nearly as bad as what Peter Holland saw one fateful night in January of 2015. Peter was an unremarkable man, an office worker, slaving away at the daily grind. And like a lot of people, Peter enjoyed nothing more than coming home after a long, hard day, kicking back and watching some TV. It was this innocent activity that led to Peter's horrifying brush with SCP-5049, altering the course of his otherwise average life forever. The event started at around 10:05 p.m. Peter was channel surfing, glued to the couch in his sparsely furnished apartment. Commercials, 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 as far as Peter's tired eyes could see. He paused for a moment to watch the end of an ad for a car he could never hope to afford on his salary. But something stopped him from changing the channel again. The next ad had begun, and it was playing a strange, scratchy jingle that gave Peter an odd sense of unease. But even stranger than that was the text on screen. Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot in baby blue bubble lettering. He forced a smile. This had to be some weird comedy skit or viral marketing campaign, or maybe it was something he drank. But no, this was a real commercial, and things were about to get even weirder. The peppy logo faded to a concerning sight. A tall humanoid figure dressed like a used car salesman, but one that definitely wasn't human. His skin was dark green and covered in patches of thick fur. He had long fingers with intimidating claws and a grin full of needle-like fangs. It looked almost demonic. and after a few seconds, the demon began to speak.
Hey there, folks, it's your man Demon Dan coming at you with the latest and greatest deals from Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot. We've just accepted a shipment of brand new models that would make even the most discerning customers weep with excitement. Let's see what we've got.
The creature, apparently named Demon Dan, stepped away from his desk, revealing two long, furry goat legs that ended in large, pointed hooves. Peter now assumed he really was going crazy, but at this point he was along for the ride. Demon Dan continued his pitch.
Looking to make your way through the capitalist hellscape that makes home look cozy? Come try one of our newest businessman models.
Dan gestured behind him to where Peter was horrified to see a total of 52 adult male human bodies hanging from a wall. There was something uncanny about them. They seemed almost hollow, like a highly realistic costume or a prop from a horror movie. Peter didn't have much time to think about it though, as Demon Dan went on.
If you're looking for an extra challenge of inequality, the businesswoman model may be a right fit for you.
The commercial then revealed a wall of human female bodies strung up in a similar fashion.
Now, you may be thinking, but Dan, business sounds hard, I just want to have some fun. And the fine team here at Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot have got you covered.
The camera zoomed out to show an area of the store filled with children's decorations, and more of these strange, hollowed-out human suits in child sizes to match.
And who has more fun than kids? No one, that's who. For a limited time, the purchase of any child-size unit comes with a complimentary 50% off coupon for parental units. You just can't say no to a deal like that.
Before Peter could process the madness that was unfolding before him, the camera cut again. The store's logo appeared on the screen once more, along with several cuts to locations around the store itself. There were more human bodies, hundreds of them. Demon Dan's sleazy voice rang out over all of it.
Here at Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot, we know it's not all fun and games. The bravest among us have a mission to accomplish. The Seven Lords are ever planning their invasion after all, so you're looking for function over form. Well, we've got that in spades down here in the Tactical Services Department. You'll be kicking ass in no time when you're wearing the latest models at the best prices.
Seven Lords? Invasion? What did any of this mean? Suddenly, the camera was showing him a new room. Red curtains parted, revealing more of these person suits, several bearing a striking resemblance to real human celebrities. He managed to make out Gucci Mane, Avril Lavigne, Paul McCartney, and Britney Spears before Demon Dan's appearance once again drew his attention.
I've got a special treat for you. We're happy to announce the VIP Lookalike Department. We all know how difficult the creation of Homunculus is. It's a fine art that takes years of practice. So when a replacement order on VIPs comes in, every detail needs to be perfect. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. But for the right price, you too can look like famous icons from around the globe.
The image of celebrity bodies faded from view, and Peter was left looking at the grinning Demon Dan standing behind the front desk of his impossible store once more. He said,
"There you have it, folks. Come on down to Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot. If you're viewing the advertisement, then you've been selected for entry. Please enter the nearest door for instant deals and upgrade those old duds for one of our newest models. What are you waiting for? Come on down."
The logo popped up again, hovering above some bold text that said, "Please enter the nearest door." Peter had had enough. He switched off the TV. What a horror show, he thought. They should just warn you before they put short horror films on TV like that. He had no idea they could just slip them in among regular commercials. Surely Demon Dan and his store couldn't be real, right? But as his eyes drifted to the door in his room, he didn't feel quite so certain. Well, there was only one way to find out. Peter got up, went over to the door, took a deep breath, and walked through it. Peter Holland was never seen again, not as himself, anyway. The SCP Foundation has long been aware of this sinister transmission, known as SCP-5049-2, and luckily has found ways to prevent it from claiming more victims. The Foundation Television Analysis Department, as well as webcrawler 40Y40, which is the software the Foundation uses to root out anomalous activity online, are always vigilant for signs of Demon Dan's commercial running. Just observing Demon Dan, who is himself classified as SCP-5049-A, and his ads put you in immediate danger, as it can transform any nearby doors into SCP-5049-1s. Those are interdimensional portals that remain active for around 15 minutes after viewing the ad. So then what specifically is SCP-5049? It's the entire pocket dimension known as Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot, a Kettier-class spatial anomaly constantly on the lookout for new human victims, which it transforms into fleshy suits for its demonic clients, which let them blend in around humans. Prior to its discovery by the Foundation, it's likely that Demon Dan and his associates claimed hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. But sadly, even discovering this anomaly came at a gruesome cost to the Foundation. On February 16, 2020, the ad played on Safe Storage Warehouse 13's break room television. At the time of the broadcast, 4 Foundation personnel were present, including Security Agent William Birkin. Worrying that this was a potential security threat, Agent Birkin investigated the door to a nearby closet. The second he opened it, he was transformed to the storefront of Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot. He saw Demon Dan himself standing at the corner, while 4 smaller reptilian imps fought over a small flesh suit. Demon Dan scolded them, before turning his attention to Agent Birkin.
Tis, you aren't supposed to be here, little man. How naughty. I'm gonna have to have a word with marketing once I'm through with you.
Agent Birkin, fearing for his safety, drew his weapon and shot Demon Dan 3 times. The creature dematerialized, before appearing right next to Agent Birkin and disarming him with a swift chop. The unfortunate security agent was then grabbed by the considerably larger Demon Dan and thrown over Dan's shoulder. We know all of this because Agent Birkin's standard issue Foundation body camera recorded the whole terrifying ordeal, even as Demon Dan dragged the helpless Birkin back into the twisted workshop behind the store. There, Birkin saw what would soon be his own fate right before his eyes. Dan's minions converting human bodies into fleshy suits for their demon clientele, and this unfortunate security officer was next. Dan gave him over to a pair of large sheep-like demons, and told them to drain, skin, and declaw him. Birkin's video feed finally cut as the demons pulled out their rusty tools and began to work on him. Of course, the SCP Foundation wouldn't take an attack on one of their operatives, inside one of their facilities no less, lying down. The unfortunate death of William Birkin allowed the Foundation to refine their methods of intercepting the broadcast of Demon Dan's commercials. They even had a new mobile task force, Mobile Strike Force Kappa 11, or the Baphomet Bashers, specifically to deal with Demon Dan and his cronies. They did more than just prevent him from taking new humans, though. When the Baphomet Bashers teamed up with an A-class clairvoyant entity to improve their efficiency in predicting future broadcasts, they were able to launch sting operations and arrest 21 different demonic customers for interrogation. This impressive strike back finally gave the Foundation some meaningful leverage over Demon Dan. And through the use of their clairvoyant entity, they were able to call a temporary truce and arrange a meeting with Demon Dan himself. Captain Steiner, an agent of the Foundation External Negotiation Department, was the one to interrogate Demon Dan. They sat across from each other at a table, and Demon Dan was clearly tense, frustrated with the way the Foundation had been messing with his business. All of their sting operations were frightening off his customers. In return for letting him continue his work, the Foundation wanted Dan to turn over all the information on his bosses and customers, allowing the Foundation to track their movements. When Dan was evasive about whether he'd comply, they tried threatening him. Dan laughed them off.
Go ahead, take your best shot, little man. There's a dozen more just like me. You won't stop anything.
Finally, he was pressured into giving a yes or no answer as to whether he'd willingly collaborate with the Foundation and act as an informant against his kind. When Demon Dan hinted that he may be willing to comply, he began to make a horrifying gurgling noise and gripped his head in pain. He began speaking in Latin in a voice that wasn't his own, as though the 7 demon lords he served were speaking through him. They said, "You are a fool, jailer, to think a pathetic morsel such as this could aid you against us. I have allowed you to toil in your own delusions for far too long. You may have taken advantage of Asmodeus all those years ago, but you stop nothing. You hinder nothing. You jail and barter to no avail. Your time is coming." And then Demon Dan's head exploded, which obviously prevented him from giving any incriminating information on those he worked for. Whoever the Demon Lords are, they're certainly the secretive type. You may think that this is the end of Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot and of SCP-5049, but soon another ad ran. It advertised the same products and services out of the same store. The only difference was that this time, a different entity was starring in it. Imagine knowing that there's a monster right under your nose. Imagine knowing that this monster is capable of killing any human being on Earth, and all because they simply saw a photograph of its face. When this monster is on the warpath, literally nothing can stop it. No weapon that human beings have invented is capable of even slowing it down. Imagine knowing, in the age of mass media, of clicks and shares, of 24-hour news, smartphones, and limitless social media connecting billions across the globe, that one stray picture of this monster leaked in the wrong place could cause the end of the world as we know it. And this fateful, terrifying day could come at any time. Congratulations, you now know how it feels to be Dr. Dan, the hot-headed lead SCP Foundation researcher on the SCP-096 case. The anomaly itself requires no real introduction. The infamous mass-murdering Shy Guy has haunted the nightmares of Foundation experts for years, but nobody is more haunted by this thing than Dr. Dan himself. For over a decade now, he has firmly believed that there's one solution to the 096 problem: termination with extreme prejudice. In his eyes, to think that 096 is ever truly contained is an illusion. They could never be sure of how many pictures of it are out there, floating around just waiting to be seen, like a time bomb waiting to go off. The resources spent containing it and cleaning up after its rampages, he would often argue, would be better spent instead figuring out how to finally kill it. But seeing as we're talking about the SCP Foundation here, not the Global Occult Coalition, the O5 Council didn't see it quite the same way. They constantly overturned Dr. Dan's termination requests, leaving the paranoid researcher more furious with each rejection. He tried to warn them again and again and again.
Don't you see? It's like a stick of dynamite, and the fuse is already lit. If you don't let me put it out before it's too late, there won't even be anyone left to pick up the pieces.
But his pleas fell on deaf ears. Until, of course, Incident 096-1-A. A dark and bloody day still looked back on with shame and horror by even the most hardened members of Foundation staff. It was the day that SCP-096 gave everyone a taste of the mass carnage it was truly capable of. Dr. Dan wasn't even there when Containment was first breached. He was off on an expedition in the snowy mountains where 096 was first found, trying to discover clues to its true origin. Dr. Dan's second-in-command, Dr. Alexei, was also lucky enough to be outside of the containment area when the Shy Guy escaped. According to interviews he gave at debriefing tribunals, he was in the break room, treating himself to a warm cup of joe. All the other personnel assigned to 096's containment and research were near its containment chamber, a giant cube made of reinforced metal, observing a live feed of data being collected from the cube's interior. As usual, sensors indicated that 096 was pacing within. For obvious reasons, the Foundation doesn't maintain any kind of live visual surveillance on 096. It wouldn't be worth the risk. But what seemed like an otherwise quiet day suddenly took a turn for the insane. The monitors began displaying terrifying data, indicating an imminent containment breach as the wails of the creature within the cube echoed out through its metal walls. Some tried to run. Others did all they could to engage emergency procedures, while guards armed with heavy weaponry rushed into the room. They all knew in their hearts that it wouldn't save them, but what else could they do? A huge dent bulged out from the side of the cube, then another, before the metal was torn open like tissue paper as the furious hands of the Shy Guy began clawing their way through it. Secondary layers of protection were deployed, but they didn't help. 096 just kept ripping through all the barriers. As everyone in attendance knew, once it was in its rage state, nothing could stop it. Literally nothing. The guards attempted to fire on the anomaly, but their bullets did no good. As the creature burst free, most of the people in the room had at least momentary visual contact with its face. In response, Code Lima was declared, and the entire chamber was flooded with a fast-acting nerve gas, killing everyone. Everyone except for 096 itself, of course. Within 2 minutes, 096 had broken free of the entire containment site and began running through the desert at breakneck speeds towards its distant target. The Foundation needed to act fast and find a way to stop it before it hit a population center where the death toll would skyrocket. Team Echo Romeo were dispatched to pursue the creature in a heavily armed attack helicopter, while MTF Tau-1, a task force specializing in SCP-096 containment and recovery, forged ahead to identify the anomaly's target, designated 096-1, and to move any other civilians out of harm's way. Dr. Dan was alerted of the disastrous situation and offered guidance to both teams from afar. Echo Romeo's chopper pursued 096, barely able to keep up. Dr. Dan recommended attempting to at least slow the creature down with heavy arms fire, even though he knew actually stopping it would be impossible. A member of the team used a modified XM500 anti-material rifle to fire several rounds at the creature, but even the shot that passed directly through its head appeared to have no effect on it. But at least they had a lock on its direction now. 096 always travels in a straight line, directly towards its target, smashing through any obstacles in its way. This means its intended direction is relatively easy to track, and people in the path of its trajectory are even easier to save. But it's a high-pressure job reserved for MTF Tau-1. Tau-1 passed over Echo Romeo and 096 in a series of 8 V-22 Ospreys, hoping beyond hope that they could outrun the creature, since there were several different towns in its direct path. But thanks once again to the one and only Dr. Dan, Echo Romeo and Tau-1 had a secret weapon that neither team had ever possessed before: Scramble. Scramble was an advanced computer program created by Dr. Dan with the help of Dr. Alexei, which was coded into microprocessors for modification into camera feeds and viewing goggles. The program had been fed intricate data concerning every single detail of 096's face, and as the name suggests, when encountering that visual data in real life, it scrambles it beyond recognition. In theory, it would make it far safer for operatives to be around SCP-096 without activating its rage state. In theory. It wasn't long before disaster struck. 096 had made its way onto I-40 and had begun attacking vehicles it encountered, killing the people inside. By this point, it had already outrun the Echo Romeo chopper, rendering them essentially useless. Tau-1 just had to forge ahead along 096's trajectory and try to get as many people out of the danger zone as possible, until 096-1 was located and destroyed by the anomaly. Years of training for an awful day like this had paid off, as the first 3 towns along 096's path were successfully evacuated. The Shy Guy just ran right through all of them, and no lives were lost. The same, however, could not be said for town number 4. As was standard procedure, Tau-1 had everyone in the town gathered up and blindfolded. The entire team in attendance had modified night vision goggles with Scramble microprocessors, so in theory, they were better off than most from 096 if things went south. The Tau-1 members tried in vain to keep everybody in line. They were threatening to shoot anyone who dared to remove their blindfold when 096 finally appeared. It tripped during its approach, rolling and shattering through several houses. Chaos erupted. Some people instinctively removed their blindfolds to see what was going on, and panicked members of Tau-1 began firing into the crowd. The screams of the civilians and the bursts of gunfire were all drowned out by the horrific wailing of 096 itself, as it tore through everyone and everything to kill the unfortunate souls who had seen its face. And given how many had removed their blindfolds during the initial pandemonium, SCP-096 had a huge number of the townspeople on its list. 096 located and grabbed the original 096-1, the person that had first glimpsed its face and caused all of this. But in the grand scheme of things, he was just one more body on the pile that day. Though of course we mean this in a purely metaphorical sense. 096 never leaves entire bodies. The Foundation operatives in attendance were able to figure out what had caused all this madness and death. 096-1 had been an amateur mountaineer and spent his vacations hiking around any mountain ranges he could gain access to, including the mountain range that 096 had been inhabiting prior to its initial capture and containment. But he hadn't actually seen 096 on that fateful trip, which had been taken over a decade ago. But in a photograph taken that day of himself, standing on a picturesque mountainside, 096 made a cameo. It took up all of 4 pixels, a tiny off-white dot against the snow on the back right side of the photograph. This photograph, with all the deadly potency of an atom bomb, had been sitting there for years, waiting. When the mountaineer was looking through old photos that morning and his eyes passed over those few blurry pixels, he didn't have any idea that he had just laid his eyes on one of the most dangerous anomalies the world has ever seen. But you don't have to know. Only 096 does. As Tau 1, led by their commander Major Jack Wilford, tried to retake control of the situation, things got even worse. It turned out Dr. Dan's scramble technology, the one thing that was supposed to have given them an edge in this situation, didn't actually work. As soon as goggle-wearing members of the team laid eyes on 096, it entered its rage state and started massacring them. It tore many of the Mobile Task Force members to shreds, including a number of the operatives required for piloting the 8 Ospreys. It was a disaster of truly epic proportions, and the catastrophic failure of Dr. Dan's scramble technology was a key factor. The root of the technology's failure was easy enough to figure out. Dr. Dan's scramble microprocessors worked fast, but not fast enough. Fractions of a second glimpses of 096's face managed to get through, and that was more than enough to set 096 off. Echo Romeo and MTF Epsilon arrived shortly afterwards to clean up the mess. It'd been a disaster of such magnitude that even a CNN reporter arrived on the scene and started filming before being promptly shut down by Epsilon. It was a member of Echo Romeo that finally slipped the bag over a docile 096's head, preparing it for containment once again, the creature now content that it had eliminated all of the unfortunate souls who had seen its face. He'd found 096 sitting next to a minivan that had its roof ripped off, the young family inside being the last to have seen its face. And things were so awful in the aftermath of the containment breach that the 05 Council changed their tune, finally granting Dr. Dan permission to terminate 096 by any means necessary. It's terrifying to think that all this can unfold because of a couple of poorly timed accidents. But it's probably even more terrifying to consider that it wasn't an accident at all. It seemed awfully convenient that both Dr. Dan and Dr. Alexei were far from danger when all hell broke loose. It was also convenient that, despite the failure of his technology being a major reason why the breach was as deadly as it was, Dr. Dan had still come out of the situation with everything he wanted. The Foundation also found this strange, and the more they looked into it, the more they found details that didn't add up. Alibis began to fall apart. Coincidences didn't seem so coincidental, and eventually a weak link in the chain was identified: Dr. Alexei. Under pressure from the Foundation, Alexei spilled everything. Dr. Dan had essentially orchestrated the entire containment breach, and on top of that, he did everything he could to make it as deadly as possible, all with the purpose of getting the 05 Council to see things his way, and finally give him the permission he needed to devote all of the SCP-096 resources to its termination. But it came at a terrible price to Dr. Dan personally. For his crimes against the Foundation and humanity, he was permitted to try and figure out a way to terminate 096 once and for all. But as payment for his crimes, he himself would also be terminated as soon as his task was complete. Were the lives of all those innocent people, and Dr. Dan himself, worth the price of finally being authorized to terminate SCP-096? When asked why he did all of this, Dr. Dan simply said, "It worked. There was only a matter of time until that happened in a major population center, and its face spread over the world news. I can kill 096, but I've killed myself in the process." While we don't agree with his methods, there's something almost admirable about a person so single-mindedly devoted to their cause. If you have ever taken a trip to Suntop Mountain in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, Washington State, then you may have come across an old wooden structure, the Suntop Fire Lookout. Built in the early 1930s, the building was used by the U.S. Forest Service to keep watch for any fires in the nearby woodland. At one point, Suntop Fire Lookout would have been manned 365 days a year, complete with a bed for staff who were stationed there on rotation. The single-story lookout house overlooks the scenic valleys of the White River and Huckleberry Creek, but you're not here for an informative tourist guide. You probably don't care about the frankly fascinating history of the lookout and how it was used as part of the aircraft warning service during World War II, watching for enemy planes. No. You're here because something much darker lurks inside the Suntop Fire Lookout. And even though it appears to be a simple one-story tall wooden structure, it certainly is not short on space. SCP-3333 refers to an anomaly that the Foundation discovered inside the Suntop Fire Lookout House. The building's interior is a single square room measuring 14 feet by 14 feet, with large windows on all 4 sides. When standing inside Suntop Fire Lookout, looking up at the wooden ceiling, one will immediately notice a trap door. No big deal, right? A lot of places have a ceiling entrance to a small crawl space. There's probably nothing behind that trap door, apart from a dusty old attic. There's a latch that maybe once had a padlock there, but not anymore. Opening the trap door will reveal a collapsible ladder. Should anyone be brave or indeed foolish enough to begin to climb, then they'll soon find themselves right back where they started, inside Suntop Fire Lookout. Or so it will seem. The thing about being in a place like the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest that surrounds Suntop Fire Lookout is that woodland areas are teeming with life. Not just plants and trees, but birds and other animals of the forest. You can never truly be alone in a setting like that. There is always life everywhere around you. So when you ascend the ladder and climb right back into the Suntop Fire Lookout, that is the first most noticeable difference you will find. It may take a while at first, but the nagging absence of something unusually so abundant in a forest will eventually become obvious. It's quiet, far too quiet. No birdsong or the sound of distant calls from woodland critters, just silence all around. Anyone ascending the ladder will find themselves in a copy of Suntop Fire Lookout's interior, 1 story higher than the ground level of the small wooden building, with the stairs leading up to the front door getting taller each time to reach up to the higher and higher building. Now you know the SCP Foundation and the types of bizarre interdimensional anomalies that they're used to dealing with. Perhaps SCP-3333 is a mirror dimension, or a plane of existence where sound doesn't travel. It certainly seems to be identical to the Suntop Fire Lookout, save for the lack of any organic life outside. Of course, it's what you'll find living inside SCP-3333 that you may want to worry about. Climbing higher up the next ladder and through the next trapdoor every time with the same result. You appear at another copy of Suntop Fire Lookout, each one higher up than the last. What first seemed to be an innocuous, unassuming wooden building is now an endless ascension up into the heavens, towards the unknown in silence, without a shred of plant or animal life outside. As you climb, perhaps you start to think about how much higher these copies go. This might even be the biblical Jacob's Ladder connecting heaven and earth. That would be nice, wouldn't it? If you were gradually climbing your way up to paradise, it might make it worth the trip. But SCP-3333 is nothing that pleasant. You wouldn't be the first to attempt this long climb. When the SCP Foundation first discovered SCP-3333, a research detail set up an on-site base camp to examine this spatial anomaly. Their first exploration involved sending a member of D-Class personnel, designated D4F68A, up the ladder. His D number is a hexadecimal code that, when translated to text, reads O, so we'll call him that for brevity's sake. During the first day's exploration, O was able to climb 184 iterations of SCP-3333, communicating with head researcher Dr. Williams below. On the second day, O could see a pair of figures standing motionless on a nearby ridge, but the pair could not be seen by Dr. Williams and the other researchers at the base camp. Both figures disappeared shortly after O spotted them with the camera he had been issued, and he felt uneasy, almost certain that he saw them point at him. The next day, at the 345th copy of Sun Top Fire Lookout, O's behavior started to noticeably change. Previously, he had been anxious about the long climb and hadn't questioned directions given to him by Dr. Williams. Now he seemed to speak more casually, resisting instructions, asking Williams to climb back down and even calling her Doc instead of Doctor. O also reported seeing writing on the walls, but there was no evidence of this on his camera. It appeared that something had started to affect him. It was when O reached level 527 that things seemed to change more dramatically. Rather than SCP-3333 continuing upwards, the copies of Sun Top Fire Lookout no longer had a trapdoor or ladder. They seemed to be arranged side by side in a grid-like pattern. Stepping out of the main doorway, O remarked on the lack of sunlight and a walkway that connected directly to the front door of the next iteration of SCP-3333. O complained about the lack of natural light and again requested to be allowed back down. Dr. Williams instructed O to use the flashlights he was provided, but they wouldn't activate and their spare batteries had vanished. O then noticed a sudden movement, and just then his microphone and camera feed went dead, almost as if someone had turned them off. It appeared that SCP-3333 had something else lurking up there. Dr. Williams oversaw the second expedition into SCP-3333. This time, members of Mobile Task Force Mod 0, also known by the codename Characteristic Eigenspaces, were sent up the ladder. Their ascent through the various copies of Sun Top Fire Lookout were not as eventful as O's, with no signs of mysterious figures or anxious feelings that O seemed to feel as he climbed. When they reached level 527, where the copies of the Lookout stopped progressing upwards and spread out in a pattern instead, their lights and equipment all seemed to be in working order. However, as the MTF team split up, one by one they encountered some sort of anomaly, or an effect of SCP-3333 that caused each of them to vanish into the dark. Either that, or something took them. These MTF units reappeared confused, and Mod 5, the team's leader Graham Purcell, issued an order to retreat and the entire squad went back down the ladders for several days, until they finally reached the base camp again. The members of Mod 0 were adamant they did not wish to climb SCP-3333 again, but Dr. Williams was beginning to understand more of the anomaly's effects. It appeared to cause abrupt changes to people's personalities, along with some sort of phenomenon that caused things to appear and disappear the higher one climbed. Assuming these were the result of a mimetic effect, Dr. Williams dispatched a counter-mimetic specialist for the next expedition. This specialist was a blind, deaf, and mute woman known as Annette, or the Null Walker, who communicated via a signaling system embedded in her hand, but was otherwise immune to any mimetic influences. Observed by Dr. Williams and Graham Purcell at base camp, Annette made her way to the top of SCP-3333, reporting that she was aware of someone watching her from outside the copies of Sun Top Fire Lookout. On her body camera, a flicker of motion occurred, something looking through the windows that ducked out of frame when the camera passed in its direction. At the apex of SCP-3333, Annette kept her flashlight off, but reported that she could detect blood, following it to what she assumed was a body. Sounds of movement surrounded her, and as Annette switched on her flashlight, Williams and Purcell saw that it wasn't a body in front of her. Instead, it was a pile of rotting organs, decomposing muscles, and discarded bones. And among the pile was a metal dog tag that read, MTF Mod 5, Graham Purcell. The same man who was sitting next to Dr. Williams at base camp. Well, the same man on the outside, at least. The explanation for everything going on inside SCP-3333, all these strange occurrences and disappearances, finally came in a video sent from Dr. Williams' cell phone. In it, a panicked Williams, covered in blood, was fleeing from something at the top of the recursive stack of SCP-3333. There was no mimetic effect at the apex of the Sun Top Fire Lookout copies. Nothing was causing the people that the Foundation sent up to act unlike themselves. They simply weren't themselves anymore. According to her frantic video, Dr. Williams had discovered the truth about what else was hiding within SCP-3333. With just the right amount of vagueness and intrigue, the research team had been drawn in. It was as if they'd been lured in by the lights of an anglerfish, realizing their grim fate only too late. The D-Class O, the MTF team, even Annette had been replaced. An unknown group of entities on the top level of SCP-3333 had been carefully observing them, waiting until they would not be seen to slip in and switch places. These entities had been creating imagined anomalous effects, like O seeing figures that weren't really there, as a way of luring more bodies further up the stack. They wanted the Foundation to keep sending expeditions into SCP-3333 to keep them coming back. The mass of organs, musculature, and bones that Annette had stumbled across, revealing the ruse, had once belonged to Graham Purcell, before he was replaced. You see, the entities residing in SCP-3333 weren't just copying people. They weren't possessing them or mind-controlling them, or even shape-shifting to steal a person's likeness. They were taking skin. These creatures hollowed out Graham, O, Annette, and the MTF team, pulling out their innards and crawling their way inside, filling these fleshy puppets and leaving their internal organs to rot. These hollowed out people became vessels for the entities of SCP-3333 to hide in. The whole thing had been a trap, intentionally exploiting human weaknesses, intrigue, and unanswered questions. You know what they say about curiosity, and these entities used it to bring more potential vessels to the top of SCP-3333. They pretended to be the people who they had replaced, imitating them so the Foundation would send more personnel to explore the tower, increasing their supply of skins. Graham's dog tag had revealed the deception, and Dr. Williams had escaped up SCP-3333. The members of the research team that had already been replaced were hot on her tail, determined to catch and hollow her out too, and by the end of her video, they had succeeded. A month later though, a team delivering supplies realized what had happened and the trapdoor was sealed. Sun Top Fire Lookout was put under permanent guard, but at least 50 personnel were killed or replaced by one of the entities. A new mobile task force, Lambda-1 Maxwell's Demons, was created to hunt down and neutralize any of the entities that had escaped SCP-3333. But it's still unknown how many left the tower and are still out there somewhere waiting to use someone's curiosity about the strange and unknown against them. On a cold October night in 2003, Shirley Yates of Seattle, Washington was just about to get ready for bed when she heard a knock at the door. She approached the door and asked the person on the other side to identify themselves. The voice outside responded immediately. It was a salesman who just wanted a few moments of Mrs. Yates' time. This was odd for two reasons. First, it was almost 10 o'clock at night, much later than is usual for door-to-door salesmen. And second, the knock hadn't come from Mrs. Yates's front door. It was coming from the door to her bathroom. Has your home ever been visited by a door-to-door salesman? If you were born in the last 40 years, then your answer to that question is probably no. In the age of online shopping, the idea of a salesperson going from house to house hawking vacuum cleaners or encyclopedia sets feels like a relic from the past. It's highly unlikely you'd ever see one walking the streets nowadays, and equally unlikely that one would knock on your front door. However, if you live in Washington state, you might need to be wary of a certain salesman who is still doing the rounds. SCP-1879, also known as the Indoor Salesman and the Doorman, is a phenomenon that manifests randomly in homes throughout Washington. Subjects will hear persistent knocking from the interior doors of their homes, and the affected door becomes classified as SCP-1879-1. The knocking doesn't stop until the door is opened, at which point the subject will be greeted by SCP-1879-2, a Caucasian man of indeterminate age standing around 170 centimeters tall. The man will claim to be a salesman and immediately try to pitch a bizarre product to the subject whose home he's just invaded. The SCP Foundation was first alerted to the existence of the indoor salesman when they had intercepted a 911 call coming from the home of Mrs. Shirley Yates. She had opened the door to her bathroom in an attempt to get the salesman to stop knocking, and once he was in her home, he refused to leave. According to Yates, he kept disappearing in and out of random doors in her house. Foundation Field Agent Rogers was equipped with a recording device and sent in to investigate the case with several other agents. When he arrived at the home, he found Mrs. Yates inconsolable. SCP-1879-2 was still rapidly talking at her, and strangely enough, the product he was holding and trying to sell to her was a Border Collie puppy. As soon as Agent Rogers entered the room, the man shifted his attention away from Mrs. Yates and towards him. He then started trying to sell the puppy to Agent Rogers. Agent Rogers did not want to purchase this puppy, but he found that the man spoke so quickly and urgently, he couldn't get a word in edgewise. The man was begging Rogers to take the puppy, practically shoving it in his face, saying that he didn't need any money, and that the only payment he needed would be some of your time. Rogers grew so annoyed at being talked over and interrupted that he ordered the other field agents to apprehend the indoor salesman. They did so, but as soon as the agents walked him out of the front door of the house, he disappeared without a trace. The agents remained in the area to monitor the situation. SCP-1879-2 manifested again in Mrs. Yates' home 6 hours later, still trying to trade the puppy for no money, just a little of her time, 12 years to be precise. After hours and hours of being worn down by this supernaturally pushy salesman, Yates relented and agreed to take the puppy, and immediately disappeared. The indoor salesman then disappeared himself through the closet door before he could be apprehended again. At a loss for what to do, the agents administered Class A amnestics to Mrs. Yates' family and left. The reason for her disappearance wasn't fully known until 12 years later in 2015, when she reappeared in the same spot she disappeared from, having no concept of how much time had passed. The puppy really had just cost her 12 years of her life. Stories like that of Shirley Yates have popped up all over the state in the years since, from Everett to Walla Walla and everywhere in between. Due to the random nature of SCP-1879 events and the way the indoor salesman can disappear instantly in and out of any door in a building, the SCP Foundation has been unable to capture him. The best they've been able to do is monitor 911 calls from across the state, listening for keywords that might indicate another SCP-1879 infestation. When such an event is reported, the Foundation deploys Mobile Task Force Row 4, aka Shoes Salesman. This task force's entire purpose is to minimize the amount of harm the indoor salesman is able to cause by intercepting him before he can make a sale. This is a very important task, as evidenced by the story of Mrs. Yates, since while the products this salesman sells might be innocent, he doesn't accept payment in any normal currency. The price he asks for his products are always bizarre and often deadly. If all someone loses is 12 years of their life, they could be considered to be getting off easy. In one instance, the product being sold was a single red rose in exchange for the subject's heart. Once the deal was sealed, the subject dropped dead on the spot, with an autopsy revealing that his heart and circulatory system vanished from inside his body. In another, the indoor salesman offered 220 bananas and told the subject to simply give him some sugar. The subject agreed, and all candied goods in the home disappeared. In a third, the indoor salesman was trying to sell a thermonuclear warhead, the price of which was the subject's soul. The subject accepted, and at first nothing seemed to have happened. The Foundation confiscated the warhead and placed it into non-anomalous containment. Later that day, the subject went to listen to some music, only to find that 2 of her vinyl records had gone missing: Lady Soul and Almighty Fire by world-famous soul singer Aretha Franklin. So, even though he's incredibly invasive, annoying, and his transactions can be deadly, the indoor salesman still maintains a sense of humor. The fact that the Foundation can't capture the indoor salesman means that a lot of questions about him remain unanswered. The biggest by far is why he does what he does. In most SCP-1879 events, the indoor salesman seems frantic and desperate to make a sale. Often he will refer to having quotas and deadlines to meet, which implies some other unseen entity that he has to answer to. These questions remain unanswered because all attempts to interrogate the indoor salesman have been unsuccessful. When he manifests in a location, it's impossible to get him to stray from his sales pitch, and he disappears as soon as he successfully sells his wares. However, there was one instance where, after an SCP-1879 event took place, Foundation agents were there to witness a rare interaction between the indoor salesman and his mysterious employers. Agent Rogers and the rest of the shoes salesmen were called out to a home in Spokane, where rapid knocking had begun to emanate from the bedroom door. Equipped with recording devices, Rogers was able to record the voice of the indoor salesman coming from inside the bedroom. In the recording, the salesman grumbled to himself about not being able to meet his quota by tomorrow, saying that if he didn't, he'd be stuck in this world for the next century. He started knocking again, yelling through the door that he knew they were home. He kept knocking until he was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing. The indoor salesman was heard picking it up, and Rogers managed to record the conversation. The person calling was, apparently, the indoor salesman's boss, who was calling to complain about his performance. Only one side of the conversation was heard, but evidently the indoor salesman's boss wasn't too happy about receiving 2 Aretha Franklin albums as payment instead of an actual human soul. The indoor salesman apologized for the joke, then told his boss, "It won't happen again, please don't hurt it. I'll meet the quota this time, I swear." He hung up, grumbling to himself again, "I better get to move up to at least accounting this time. I've paid my dues and then some." Rogers finally opened the door to the apparent disappointment of the indoor salesman, who was hoping to speak with the home's owner and was quite annoyed at having another one of his sales interrupted by MTF Row 4. Rogers tried to ask the indoor salesman who he'd just been speaking to on the phone, but as usual, the salesman started talking over him. "Now see here, let's think logically," he said. "You know I'm not going to tell you anything. I know you're not likely to buy what I'm selling. So let's just move on to greener pastures. I'm coming up close to a deadline, and I'm sure you're swamped with making sure good people don't lose their jobs, so I'll just be on my way and let you do that. Ciao." The indoor salesman tried to close the door, but Agent Rogers blocked it with his arm. He was tired of this SCP giving him the runaround, and he was going to keep the indoor salesman here if it was the last thing he did. He demanded the entity stay and be interviewed, and other members of the task force apprehended the salesman, making sure he couldn't leave the room. The indoor salesman, now held in place by several armed men, seemed to finally relent. He told Rogers, "I'm busy, so I'll tell you what. I'm going to give you something, no money out of your pocket, and we'll call it even. Sound good?" Rogers, just wanting to get this whole thing over with, agreed to those terms. 3 seconds later, every agent on the scene was dead, and the indoor salesman was able to straighten his tie, pick up his briefcase, and walk through the door to the bathroom. When the bodies of Agent Rogers and the rest of the MTF Row 4 were examined by Foundation scientists, the cause of death was found to be, in every case, thousands of coins suddenly appearing in not only their pockets, but also inside their stomachs, lungs, and even under their skin. Later that day, the indoor salesman was reported at a home in the same neighborhood. He was seen trying to sell the house's owner, 80-year-old retiree Alan Johnson, a Glock 18 pistol in exchange for his attention. As he had done so many times before, the indoor salesman disappeared through another door before the Foundation was able to reach the scene. And when the SCP arrived, they found Mr. Johnson still alive, but now missing his prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls attention. It's likely that, because of the nature of the entity, SCP-1879 might be entirely impossible to contain. The Foundation might never find out anything more than what they already know about the indoor salesman, the way he's able to manifest behind closed doors, or the reason he has to keep filling quotas for an unseen boss who apparently doesn't have a very good sense of humor. So, if you're ever in Washington State, be careful who you open your doors to, especially if the knocking you hear is coming from inside your house. A D-Class drag races through the testing zone, screaming at the top of his lungs and doing donuts. A Mime who is also in the testing chamber stares with disapproval, tapping his foot impatiently. Did we mention that the car is made of spiders? Yeah, this one is going to be a weird one, folks. Stay tuned for one of the craziest SCP stories you've ever heard. Emily had always dreamed of taking a trip to Paris. When the opportunity actually came to visit the city, she was overjoyed. She spent her time exploring art museums, tasting the bread and cheese, and walking through the city streets, taking in the sights. One of her favorite things about Paris was all of the street performers. As she walked, nibbling on a pain au chocolat, she delighted in the antics of jugglers, tossing colorful balls into the air. She gasped at the feat of athleticism and grace demonstrated by acrobats and contortionists. She giggled at the absurd shows put on by puppeteers and dabbed tears from her eyes at the sound of beautiful songs played and sung by musicians. It became part of her daily routine. One night, as Emily was walking back to her hostel after a long, languid dinner, she found herself walking down a street she had not encountered before. There was no one around except for her. It was a lovely moment of peace, but it also struck her as a little bit eerie, and she wished for the familiar throngs of people. Up ahead, she spotted the silhouette of another person and let out a sigh of relief. As she got closer, she could make out the black and white striped shirt, the suspenders, the black beret, the white face makeup, rouged cheeks, and red lips. A mime. A real, classic French mime. She couldn't believe her luck. When he spotted Emily approaching, the mime began to start a performance. He began with a classic, the invisible box. He felt around the walls of the invisible box, looking out with exaggerated wide eyes and an open mouth. Emily clapped and reached into her bag for a little bit of money she could use to tip him. After all, he was putting on a performance just for her. He deserved it. She walked closer to the mime, looking for a place to put her tip. She didn't see one, so she held up her hand, offering the money directly to the mime. As he took notice of how close she was getting, the mime began shaking his head vigorously, eyes wide and insistent. She didn't understand that he was trying to warn her until it was too late. Dozens and dozens of spiders began to crawl over the mime's face, out from inside of his clothes, from his shoes, pouring out over the street, and crawling up onto Emily. She tried to brush them off, she tried to run away, but no matter how hard she tried, the spiders just kept coming. All she could do was scream. In an attempt to experience a little bit of live performance, Emily unwittingly came across SCP-3247. SCP-3247 is a humanoid entity standing at approximately 1.7 meters in height. It wears a striped shirt and suspenders similar to the garb of a stereotypical French mime, as well as what appears to be white makeup on its face and all other exposed skin. Though these aspects of its appearance seem as if they should be removable, the clothing and makeup are, in fact, parts of the entity's physiology and cannot be removed from its body. This is not the only unusual aspect of the entity's physical form. Though it looks corporeal and solid, the entity cannot touch or directly interact with any solid matter, with one particular exception. There is a colony of spiders living on and inside of SCP-3247. These spiders have officially been designated SCP-3247-A and are highly protective of SCP-3247. If anyone or anything attempts to approach SCP-3247 in a threatening manner, the spiders will swarm the potential threat. As any savvy anomalous activity enthusiast might have already gathered, these are, of course, no ordinary spiders. Not only do they dwell on and in an intangible mime, but they have a peculiar response to witnessing a human being making specific gestures or pantomiming activities. When this occurs, the colony of spiders will form the shape of an object related to the gestures, which they will then hold for up to 3 hours, or until given additional stimuli that prompt a change in shape. While the spider colony is assembled into shape, they will be able to share some of the given object's functions in spite of being technically nothing more than a mass of well-coordinated arachnids. As for SCP-3247, it is either incapable of speech or unwilling to speak. Instead, it communicates with Foundation staff via silent miming. When it does, the spiders will frequently react to its gestures, becoming effectively living props. SCP-3247 does not seem to be especially thrilled with this, likely because miming is inherently a propless art form, and these spider-based props undermine its artistic vision. Otherwise, though, the presence of the spiders does not seem to bother SCP-3247. In order to better understand the nature of SCP-3247-A, Foundation staff conducted a series of tests.
In each test, a D-Class was given a gesture to perform in the presence of SCP-3247. Then, the research staff would record the spider colony's response. During the first test, the research staff ordered D-11424 to attempt to get as close to SCP-3247 as possible. They did not, of course, warn him about the spiders. He entered the testing chamber and approached the Mime, who was pantomiming the act of climbing stairs. As the Mime pretended to ascend an invisible staircase and D-11424 grew closer, instances of SCP-3247-A emerged to take the shape of a staircase, much to the Mime's frustration. SCP-3247 stopped its performance, throwing up its hands in a gesture of defeat. The spiders turned their attention to D-11424 and began to swarm him, treating him as a potential threat. Panicking and unsure how to communicate with SCP-3247 while the spiders were overpowering him, D-11424 began to wave frantically at the Mime. The Mime simply shrugged, giving him a look that said, "Well, what do you want me to do about it?" At this point, Control intervened, instructing D-11424 to pantomime some kind of activity. Fortunately, before turning to a life of crime, D-11424 had spent several years in a professional improv troupe and was well acquainted with pantomime. His performing instincts kicked in, and he leapt into action. He put a hand to his ear as if listening to the ringing of a telephone. The spiders stopped their attack, responding immediately to his cue. They formed into the shape of a small table, with an old-fashioned rotary phone on top. The Mime rolled its eyes in disdain at the sight of this prop-based performance, but D-11424 was on a roll. He crossed to the phone, picked up the receiver, and held it to his ear. "Hello?" he asked out of habit. He wasn't expecting to hear a voice on the other line, but then he did. Or rather, he heard the approximation of a human voice, created by a swarm of anomalous spiders. It sounded a bit like a human voice sped up, high-pitched, and squeaky, speaking some sort of gibberish. Realizing that this was his moment to escape, D-11424 placed the phone back in place and promptly left the testing chamber. The spiders remained in the shape of the rotary phone and the table for the next 2 hours, at which point they disassembled and returned to their home on SCP-3247. After his surprisingly creative work in this first test, it was decided that D-11424 would be the designated test subject for all future testing with SCP-3247, provided that additional complications did not arise. Though he wasn't especially fond of spiders, D-11424 was more than happy to accept the assignment, not that he had much choice in the matter. Still, it was definitely a better deal than getting fed to SCP-682, and it was a nice excuse to use his improv skills again after a long retirement. During the second test, D-11424 knew what to expect from SCP-3247. For this test, he was told to pantomime playing tug-of-war with an invisible opponent and an invisible rope. Now that he knew his improvisational scene partner would be a colony of spiders, he was able to enter the testing chamber with confidence. Once inside, he began to pantomime, pulling on a rope, having that rope tugged away from him by a strong opponent, and struggling to pull back. The spiders reacted right away, arranging themselves into the shapes of a long rope, one side of which was in D-11424's hands, as well as a large humanoid, vaguely muscular in shape, that was holding the other side of the rope. The spiders gave the rope a sharp tug, causing D-11424 to lose his balance and fall over, the rope slipping out of his grasp. Aside from some injury to his pride, he was otherwise unharmed. During test number 3, D-11424 was instructed to enter the testing chamber and close his fist, while extending the thumb and index finger in a gesture colloquially known as finger guns. Sure enough, as soon as he assumed this position, the spiders assembled into the shape of a handgun. D-11424 was then instructed to pick up the spider gun and squeeze the place where the trigger would be if it was a real gun and not, spiders. A loud cracking sound was heard when the D-Class squeezed, as a spider shot out of the barrel of the gun at high speed before smacking into the nearby wall, leaving a small hole in the surface. D-11424 fired several more times, each shot firing an individual spider at a pace that attending researchers described as faster than a speeding bullet. After firing 6 rounds of spiders at the wall, D-11424 was instructed to place the spider gun back on the ground. During test number 76, D-11424 was ordered to hold his hands together and wiggle 4 fingers on each hand, effectively pantomiming a spider. The research team was curious to see what the spiders would do when presented with a shape that matched their usual unassembled form. SCP-3247, who generally did not react much to the experiments on its spiders, began shaking its head in mild disappointment as approximately 640 spiders emerged from its body, dividing themselves into groups of 8. Each group of 8 spiders then joined to form one large spider, leaving 8 spiders. These 8 then split into pairs, who joined together into one larger spider, and so on and so forth until there was one single giant spider made from the hundreds of smaller spiders. At this point, D11424 followed his heart, jumping onto the mega spider's back and riding it like a bull at the rodeo, as the spider bucked and ran back and forth across the room. According to official transcripts, D11424 yelled "Yee-haw" throughout this part of the test, until the head researcher ordered him to climb down from the spider and exit the room. He was reprimanded for his behavior and warned that if he acted without approval again, he would be taken off the project and reassigned to a much less enjoyable position as one of the designated eyes on SCP-173. D11424 immediately agreed to comply with future instructions. During test number 133, D11424 was sent into the testing chamber and told to shadowbox. He danced back and forth across the cell, doing his best Sylvester Stallone impression and throwing punches in the general direction of the spiders. In response, approximately 3,000 spiders poured out of SCP-3247, assembling into the shadowy shape of a boxer, and began to attack D11424. The mass of spiders conducted itself at the level of a professional boxer, dodging D11424's hits before coming back at him with a jab, cross, lead uppercut, and rear uppercut before he could defend himself. D11424 fell to the ground unconscious, and guards were forced to interrupt the test in order to remove him from the room and take him to the infirmary for medical treatment. After taking some time to recuperate, D11424 returned to testing with SCP-3247-A. He was instructed to mime steering a wheel, such as that of a car. Immediately, a number of spiders previously unseen during testing emerged from SCP-3247, arranging themselves into the shape of a sedan. D11424 was then commanded to climb inside of the spider car and see if he could start it. He refused, insisting, "I'm not getting in a spider car, are you nuts?" When pressed by Control to comply with orders, he made a rude hand gesture. I'll let you guess what that was. The spiders began to scramble to reassemble themselves in response to the changed gesture, prompting Control to stop the test early to spare the researchers' sensibilities. With strict guidelines to avoid inappropriate or violent gestures, D11424 was sent back into the testing chamber with instruction to try out a variety of animal-inspired gestures in rapid succession. He formed one hand into a fist and made a peace sign with the other hand, putting them together to make a snail. As he made his hand snail crawl through the air, the spiders crawled onto the floor and assembled into the shape of a snail in front of D11424. Though the spiders moved quickly, at their usual scuttling pace, once they formed into the snail, they slowed to a gradual creep. D11424 noted a shiny, slimy trail left behind on the floor as the spider snail moved. He was asked to consider touching it, but refused, simply stating, "Ew, no." Next, he took his hands and formed the shape of a wolf's head howling at the moon. The research staff were curious to see if the spiders would form a wolf's head or the animal's entire body. They got their answer as the spiders swarmed and shifted, forming the shape of a full-sized gray wolf. The wolf padded back and forth across the room before sitting down, lifting its head, and emitting an audible howl that sounded almost indistinguishable from the real thing. Next, D11424 crossed his thumbs over each other, fluttering hands like a pair of wings. The spiders separated into smaller groups and came together to form butterflies similar in size to a monarch. These spider butterflies began to flap their wings and, much to D11424's surprise, they took flight and swirled through the air around him. The D-Class was so moved by the beautiful sight that he shed a single tear, which he promptly wiped away out of embarrassment. Control then prompted him to try the next animal gesture. D11424 used his hands to form the shape of a rabbit. Several of the spiders crawled away, returning to SCP-3247, and the remaining spiders took on the form of a rabbit. The spider rabbit hopped realistically around the room, twitching its ears and tail. At this point, D11424 was instructed to offer the spider rabbit a carrot, he produced a carrot from his pocket, holding it out in front of him. The spider rabbit hopped over to him and, one crunch at a time, began to eat the carrot until none remained. D11424 appeared shaken up and asked to leave the testing chamber. As he followed all of his instructions, this request was granted. When he exited the chamber, all he would say was, "Where the hell did the carrot go? It doesn't have a stomach, it doesn't have a mouth, where did it go?" SCP-3247 is kept in an isolated chamber located in the arachnid wing of Area 12. It does not appear to require food or rest, but it has been provided with a television and a collection of silent films for morale purposes. Instances of SCP-3247-A are fed via a fully automated system that dispenses 20 grams of live crickets every week. Should a containment breach occur, staff have been instructed to find a way to make escaped spiders take on the shape that renders them motionless, then simply pick the spider cluster up and place it back inside of the cell. It is unlikely that the Foundation will ever get an explanation for where the intangible Mime and his merry band of spider performers originated from. But one thing is clear, they won't be performing in public again anytime soon. Somehow, most likely through some nefarious means, a fateful postcard has been sent to one of the residents of the murky, mysterious Aranirum Island. Living on this particular island was already a strange and scary enough existence, given the horrors the inhabitants of Anarirum share their home with. But perhaps the only thing just as horrible as life on that island was being sent a postcard. Sure, that doesn't sound all that horrible. Postcards are usually used to show a corner of the world far away and extend well wishes from friends or relatives on vacations. But ordinarily, postcards don't depict a photo of SCP-096 with the words, "Wish he was there," scrawled on the other side. From its containment cell at the SCP Foundation, the Shy Guy instantly sensed that somebody, somewhere, had seen a picture of its face. Breaking down into an enraged fit of homicidal insecurity, SCP-096 immediately broke from its containment chamber and made a cross-country beeline, heading straight for Aranirum at anomalously accelerated speeds. Little did the creature or the Foundation know that the Shy Guy was being led straight into a trap, and the poor island resident who had received the chilling postcard, well, they were unlucky enough to be the bait. While the SCP Foundation started frantically trying to track down where it had gone, the Shy Guy had already made its way to a wooden cabin belonging to the unfortunate postcard recipient. Emerging from the now emptied home once the owner was no more, SCP-096 would have returned to his cell just as quickly as he left. That is, if he wasn't the only monstrous creature on the island. A loud and sudden noise caught the creature's attention, the sound of an old steam train whistle. It rang out once more, from somewhere off in the distance, but there was so much thick fog hanging in the air around Aranirum that it was almost impossible to see anything, especially with how dark it was. The second time the whistle sounded, it was closer, but there was another sound too, and not the loud chugging of a steam engine that you would expect. It was an erratic, heavy thudding, the noise of lots of somethings drumming against the ground, causing the earth itself to shudder. Legs. They were the steps of multiple huge legs, crawling across the surface of the island, heading straight towards SCP-096. A third piercing whistle rang out, even closer still. This time, the orange glow of a light could be seen, dulled by the surrounding fog, but getting brighter and clearer as it came closer. The light was casting shadows against the dark fog, long, spindly shapes of spidery appendages, until before the Shy Guy's eyes, a creature of pure nightmares came bursting out of the fog. It was a monstrous sight, even to SCP-096. Its body was the red front engine of an old-fashioned steam train, hoisted off the ground by 4 pairs of enormous black, spindly, spider-like legs that propelled the beast forwards at a terrifying speed. Able to move without the limitations of needing to follow a railroad track, the monster was barreling towards SCP-096 with a twisted smile on its grotesque face. At the front of the locomotive was its circular face, with its unnaturally white eyes and a mouth that sported rows of razor-sharp teeth, all covered in blood. This hellish abomination, a being that was part steam engine and part giant spider, was the terror of Aranirum himself, the carnivorous CHOO Charles. Seeing Charles racing towards them on its 8 spider legs would be enough to make anyone freeze up and stop in their tracks out of sheer terror, and SCP-096 was compelled to do the same. Except the terrifying train creature's pale eyes were looking directly at the Shy Guy. As Charles sized the anomaly up as its next meal, he was looking at it, and that meant SCP-096 had to kill him. The question was, how could it? How could the skinny, spindly humanoid hope to even fight something like CHOO Charles? He was much bigger, even more fearsome. But as quick as Charles could move on his spidery legs, he was not faster than SCP-096. In the blink of an eye, the Shy Guy raced off shrieking and sobbing in despair, leaving Charles to continue roaming his island territory in search of other human inhabitants to terrorize. SCP-096 had retreated to some nearby woods, quick enough to move out of Charles's path somewhere it could hide, for now. But the Shy Guy could feel a familiar, painful feeling, almost pulling him back towards CHOO Charles, right back into harm's way. SCP-096 possessed an inescapable compulsion to kill anyone who looked at its face, and that seemed to include horrifying part train, part spider hybrids. It was a fact of the Shy Guy's very existence. He had to go after whoever looked at him and make them pay. In fact, it took all the creature's own strength not to instantly rush back over to Charles to try. SCP-096 knew that if it did, then there was little chance it would survive coming face to face with the terror of Aranirum. However, while it was watching CHOO Charles from a safe distance, seeing him crawl across the landscape on his multiple legs, that SCP-096 noticed something. It was another light obscured by the fog, but this one was much higher up. One could almost mistake it for the moon, if it wasn't getting closer, all the while accompanied by the sound of whirring rotors. While the Shy Guy had been evading CHOO Charles, the SCP Foundation had been tirelessly trying to track down its location, and now they'd found their runaway anomaly here on Aranirum Island. As the chopper carrying the mobile task force drew nearer, the tyrannical train turned and took notice. To SCP-096, the Foundation's arrival could have meant a way home and away from the spidery steam engine. But to Charles, the approaching chopper meant only one thing: a new source of food.
Captain!
One of the MTF troops aboard the chopper called over his headset.
What is it? Do we have eyes on SCP-096?
The captain replied before realizing what he'd said.
Well, not eyes on, because then they would have jumped up onto the chopper and killed us all. I mean, is there any sign of SCP-096 on the island? Negative, sir, although you should probably see this,
the soldier replied. Begrudgingly, the captain unbuckled himself from his seat and snatched the Foundation operative's binoculars, using them to look down at Aranirum below. It didn't take him long to spot the massive, multi-legged monstrosity that was CHOO Charles, who had fallen still, waiting for the chopper to descend low enough for him to reach.
Good gravy, what on earth is that thing?
The captain exclaimed, before taking another look through the binoculars.
Is that? Wait, what is an instance of SCP-2086 doing out here?
SCP-2086 was an infamous anomalous species the Foundation had encountered before. Much like Charles, they were anthropod-like creatures with multiple long legs that protruded from a body resembling a man-made mode of transport. However, SCP-2086s usually took on the appearance of buses while in vehicle form.
Sir, I don't think that's an SCP-2086,
the lookout replied.
To me, it looks more like an instance of SCP-3023. Impossible, all the way out here?
The captain retorted.
We're nowhere near the region where the anomaly occurs. It could have scurried its way from Germany and taken nest here, sir,
the trooper responded. Yet another anomaly that CHOO Charles bore a striking resemblance to. SCP-3023 was a rare phenomenon that was known to occur at random, but was limited to a specific area of central Germany. The effect of this phenomenon caused ordinary, everyday, inanimate objects of any shape or size to suddenly turn into aggressive spiders, sporting 8 legs that grew from whatever was affected by SCP-3023. Perhaps CHOO Charles was indeed an instance of SCP-3023, or some distant evolutionary offshoot of SCP-2086. It was hard to say for sure. The only thing for sure was that Charles was a man-eating beast, more so than an insidious villain. And being so highly territorial, he considered the entire island of Aranirum to be his natural habitat and his hunting ground. Anything that arrived in his vicinity was prey to the terrifying train, and his ravenous craving for human flesh meant he was ready to attack the descending SCP Foundation chopper.
All right, let's go, go, go!
The MTF captain called to his troops, signaling them to start rappelling out of the helicopter and down to the island.
Keep your scramble goggles on max, we still need to recapture 096. But first priority is taking down this big ugly beast.
Wearing goggles specifically designed to distort the Shy Guy from their view, the team began abseiling out of the aircraft. But CHOO Charles was already waiting for them. Rearing back on its four back legs, the nightmarish train spider swiped at the descending MTF operatives. What first seemed like an instinctive, uncoordinated assault quickly became precise and relentless strikes as Charles sliced through some of the cables the MTF troops were using to rappel down. Their lifeline cut, the unlucky Foundation operatives plummeted from mid-air, right down towards where the terror of Aranirum was waiting for them to fall. A few of the MTFs made it to the ground alive, and immediately began retaliating against CHOO Charles. The gunfire from their weapons flickered all around the carnivorous creature, but their bullets could barely chip the red paintwork on his steam-train body. Dashing towards his helpless human prey on his many legs, Charles began to feast. Then suddenly, something started pulling at one of his huge spider legs, pulling Charles back moments before he had a chance to claim his latest victim, the captain of the Foundation's MTF. It was SCP-096, having zipped out of hiding and shrieking wildly as it used all of its strength to wrench one of CHOO Charles's multiple limbs. Angered that it couldn't reach the MTF captain, the part spider, part train hybrid stomped the leg that was being pulled in a successful attempt to free itself from the Shy Guy's grip. But in the same instant, SCP-096 used its anomalous speed to reappear in front of the already angered locomotive monster. With his railroad rage about to reach its breaking point, Charles entered into a relentless rampage, making quick work of the leftover MTF troops before setting his sights squarely on SCP-096. But doing that was his biggest mistake. Now CHOO Charles had seen the Shy Guy twice, and to the insecure anomaly, that meant Charles had to go. Traveling faster than even the multi-legged monstrosity could perceive, SCP-096 began racing towards CHOO Charles's many legs. The Shy Guy had realized that it didn't stand a chance of dealing with the terror of Aranirum the same way it handled all the others that had seen its face. So instead, it had settled on a new approach, specifically tailored to taking down the spider-legged steam engine. One by one, SCP-096 started knocking Charles's many legs out from underneath him, effectively tripping him up over and over again. The Shy Guy moved so quick that the cumbersome Charles could barely react in time, having one leg after the other knocked out from beneath him, causing him to tumble to the ground. Normally, CHOO Charles was smart enough to retreat if he encountered something that could fight back. If he was injured badly enough, the spider-like creature would scuttle out of harm's way in order to heal his wounds. But the rage at being constantly tripped up by SCP-096 was distracting Charles from the Shy Guy's true ploy. With every leg it knocked out from underneath the spidery steam train, SCP-096 had been gradually directing Charles towards a nearby gorge. With a terrifying burst of anomalous speed, the Shy Guy caused CHOO Charles to topple over sideways, rolling over himself until he landed upside down in the bottom of the rocky gorge. The multi-legged locomotive monster's spindly legs flailed desperately as he tried to reposition himself, but with no luck. SCP-096 had managed what first seemed to be impossible and beaten the terror of Aranirum, CHOO Charles. Or, for now, at least.
You all know exactly who I am.
The bald chemistry teacher looked around at the men surrounding him in the desert. Cadillacs, leather jackets, blacked-out shades. The gang members shifted nervously from foot to foot as the man bragged openly about what he's done to build his criminal empire. Walter White's attention turned back to the man in front of him. A slight sneer played around his lips. Now, say my name. The man took a moment to reply as the desert wind blew behind him. He seemed to be weighing his options, realizing quickly that he had lost all control over the situation. You're Heisenberg. You're God. Bang! Walter White fell to the ground dead. The characters all around yelped in surprise, drew their guns, and started wildly pointing them around the circle, trying to figure out who killed the great Heisenberg. But his killer just stared in awe from his couch in the front room as the Netflix show kept playing on the TV. Had the toy gun in his hand really done that? Josh had admitted to himself that he had a problem a long time ago. But at least being a yard sale addict was cheaper than just a regular old retail addict. Actually, in truth, he was also an estate sale addict, a garage sale addict, and a thrift store addict. Anywhere you could buy people's old junk for rock-bottom prices, he would sniff it out. The Saturday that his life changed forever was just like any other Saturday, really. In the sweaty heat of the Atlantic City suburbs, he hadn't meant to stop by any sales today, but one just so happened to catch his eye. There was a box marked Nerd Stuff, and he took that as a personal challenge. Was this some old lady's version of Nerd Stuff or a veteran dungeon master's treasure trove? The reality was somewhere in between the two. There were a couple of seasons of Buffy on VHS, a copy of the original Deus Ex, and some Legend of Zelda plushies. It hadn't really been worth stopping his car for, except for a little plastic splash of color that caught his eye. Josh reached way down to the bottom of the box and rooted around for it. There was no way. It couldn't possibly be the toy he'd spent all his childhood asking for and never getting, but in fact, it was. A 1985 Nintendo Entertainment System Zapper, with an orange grip and barrel, NES gray bodywork, and the beautiful font printed along the side. It was unmistakable. He threw a wad of cash at the old lady behind the table and rushed back into his car quickly as he could. It was time to cancel his day plans. He had a childhood dream to fulfill. But no sooner that he had got home and flipped on his TV, the dream came crashing down around him. His old NES, the one he'd had since he was a little kid, had sadly keeled over. It refused to power on, no matter what he did. So that made his zapper pretty much useless. The best he could do with it now would be to point it at the TV and make pew-pew noises with his mouth. So Josh opened up Netflix and put on an episode of Breaking Bad. Little did he know, as he raised the zapper to the screen, that he was actually in possession of SCP-674. Nobody would know looking at it on the surface. Even the most hardcore gamers wouldn't have a clue, because you can fully disassemble, clean, and reassemble the zapper and get no indication that it's anything other than what it appears to be. However, as soon as the gun is pointed at a television screen or a computer monitor of any kind, it starts to pose a very real threat. Or at least a very real fictional threat. If you shoot at the screen, whatever media is playing on it at the time will react and adapt to what has just happened. That means characters on the screens will react in accordance with the rules of their respective universes. In a grounded, realistic drama, the gunshot will behave like any other, killing or wounding the victim, with perhaps enough time for them to give a dying monologue. But in an episode of Rick and Morty, the shot could manifest in any number of bizarre and creative ways. News crews that witness the user shooting a person in their live report will continue to cover the incident as if it is part of the ongoing story. If you shoot Walter White, he falls to the ground dead. Josh stared at the screen in utter amazement. He didn't expect the writers to kill off their main character just like that. Wasn't there supposed to be another 9 episodes? What would they do to fill all that time? As the episode played out, it seemed to mostly just follow Jesse, trying desperately to escape with his money before it was too late. He kept glancing towards the camera for some reason, with a slight look of fear in his eyes. Very strange creative decision there. Josh backed out of the show to scroll through his continue watching. There was something a little creepy about how he'd pointed the zapper at the TV, pulled the trigger, and perfectly, at that moment, a character had been shot. Time to pick out another show without any guns and murder for a bit. You know, something safe. The familiar melodica tune filled the lounge as various shots of Dunder Mifflin employees busied themselves, shredding credit cards and answering phone calls. It never ceased to make his worries go away seeing the words "The Office" appear on the screen. He settled into the couch, watching as the characters all gathered in the conference room for some first aid training. The CPR dummy lay on the floor with Michael Scott earnestly explaining to the woman that the victim appeared to have lost their limbs. He laughed along as the scene descended into chaos, as none of the employees took the training seriously at all. Even though he'd seen this episode countless times, it never got old. Absent-mindedly, he pointed the gun at the TV and pulled the trigger. Bang! Pam collapsed on the ground. All of the characters dove out of the way, trying to find cover behind their chairs, not daring to peek out at the camera. Only the first aid lady stayed on the scene, trying her best to resuscitate Pam. It cut to a shot of Dwight talking to the camera sadly. He said that it was almost funny, but there was a real heaviness in the moment. His eyes were red, like he'd been crying off camera. Josh flipped the TV off and stared at himself in the dark reflection. Was he dreaming? He hadn't just done that, had he? Fortunately for Josh and for the rest of humanity, he had not killed Jenna Fischer or Bryan Cranston. He hadn't even killed their characters in the shows, at least not for anyone other than himself. Research into SCP-674 shows that the appearance of characters being killed off on screen only exists in the mind of the shooter. For everyone else, the office remains the same as it always was. Unfortunately for Josh, however, Pam is now dead in that universe and will always be whenever he watches an episode. It leaves a real shadow over the later seasons, but the characters apparently managed to do a good job pivoting into its new, darker tone. Other shows that have been tested in research conditions have yielded interesting results. Like in Star Trek, it is impossible to actually kill Captain Kirk. Instead, various red shirts always just so happen to dive in front of him or fall into frame at the pivotal moment. With a small dead zone on the right-hand side of the screen, characters who witness enough shootings have the sense to stick to that side of the frame whenever the shot is on them, sometimes going so far as to plead directly with the viewer, breaking the fourth wall in their desperation to survive. When Josh came back from a long walk outside, he'd convinced himself that what he had seen earlier was all just some vivid dream. A dream he didn't remember waking up from, but definitely wasn't happening anymore. He'd play some video games, that's what he would do. He had decided he would just play some Super Smash Bros. And unwind. Anyone who has ever said that sentence to themselves will know firsthand how foolish that is. Not 10 minutes later, Josh had definitely forgotten all about his dream from before. He was too busy raging and cursing at the screen. He couldn't stand playing against King Dedede. That stupid hammer move always got him. Without thinking, Josh snatched the zapper from the couch next to him and blasted Dedede right in the face. In classic Smash Bros. Style, the giant Penguin King was launched backwards, flying off the screen in a blast of colorful smoke. But he didn't respawn. For a second, his character just stood on the screen awkwardly before it kicked him back out to the character select screen. This time though, King Dedede's picture was missing. Josh couldn't help himself. He set up a free-for-all match straight away, picking all the characters he hated to fight against. Sonic, Mario, Pikachu, Bowser, Link, Ness, even Wii Fit Trainer. One after the other. Bang, bang, bang. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction once he'd done his work. Great. Now the character list only had the fair, balanced ones left. They just so happened to all be his favorite characters too. But why stop there? Josh jumped across to Elden Ring and marched his knight up through the gate to Stormvale Castle. Before Margit even had gotten through his opening cutscene, Josh had shot the boss right in the face. This boss battle that he'd been stuck on for hours was over before it even started. What could he do now? He put on an episode of Stranger Things and shot the Demogorgon, then Moff Gideon in The Mandalorian, and some goblins in Hogwarts Legacy. The clickers from The Last of Us took a couple extra shots but went down easy enough. He went over to his PC and killed the Ender Dragon in Minecraft without blowing up any beds. He won a game of Rocket League 53-0 after he shot both cars on the opposing team. He played through doors in Roblox without a single jump scare. He would just shoot any monster that filled his screen. What could be better? He reckoned it was time for more movies. Walking back across the lounge, spinning the gun around his finger like a western, he wondered if now would be a good chance to hunt down all the legendary animals in Red Dead 2. It would certainly make the job a lot easier if he could kill them all in just one shot. He'd just need to be careful not to shoot Arthur by accident. But then Josh sat on the remote. The TV flicked over to an old rerun of Bob Ross just as he'd been squaring up to shoot. He pulled the trigger before he could react. The canvas was splattered red. From somewhere off camera, he heard the artist's wheezing voice try to comfort him. "There are no mistakes, just happy." But he died before he could say another word. The Exposition Gun first came onto the SCP Foundation's radar when a strange police report was doing the rounds on an email chain amongst local authorities. They were all finding a great deal of value from a man called Josh, who had turned himself in at his local station in Atlantic City for, quote, killing like everyone. Naturally, the police took his report very seriously, for all of about 10 minutes. As soon as they realized he was talking about video games, TV, and movie characters, the whole case turned into one big joke. They sat Josh down in front of a TV and played him episodes of the shows he was talking about, pointing out characters still alive in scenes after he'd supposedly shot them to death. But he seemed to just grow more distressed as he realized he was experiencing this phenomenon alone. By the time Foundation agents tracked Josh down and took him in for questioning, the gun had moved on. He marched it straight back to the old lady who'd sold it to him, who had then sold it on again. Josh's full account of events and description of the zapper were taken before he was administered Class C amnestics and allowed to continue with his yard sale addiction uninhibited. SCP-674 was found sometime later in the possession of a 33-year-old Caucasian male simply referred to as Mr. S. A reclusive man in a neighboring city, Mr. S first gained the SCP Foundation's attention through his extremist political blog, in which he claimed to have assassinated prominent political figures, news anchors, and talk show hosts. While the truth of those claims was demonstrably false, it was clear from the way he described events that he really did believe the delusion. After being questioned, it was discovered that he had never left his home. Instead, he stayed on his couch, watching news reports and firing at any prominent figures that appeared, believing that he was indeed killing them in the real world. Despite claiming that he was using SCP-674 to prevent a military police state, using the device to assassinate so many high-profile figures had the opposite effect on his video reality. In his blog posts, he described an increasingly unstable global order, martial law, and catastrophic events consistent with the hypothetical release of 2 deadly SCPs. His house was barricaded, with security cameras set up in every direction. The more he had been using the gun, the more the characters and journalists on TV had threatened him, claiming that the SCP Foundation were on their way to apprehend him and that he would face retribution for what he had been doing. Mr. S's intended ambush of Foundation agents failed. While they appeared to be dying on the security feeds he had set up, the agents experienced no physical harm in reality as they apprehended the man and seized SCP-674. While the majority of researchers have deemed that SCP-674 is harmless to all but the mental well-being of the shooter, there was a notably sinister result to Mr. S's time in Foundation detention. Alone in his cell, Mr. S soon started to engage in heated arguments with the security camera set up to monitor him. There is no record of any voices in the room other than his own, yet he seemed to be locked in a fierce argument. All of a sudden, Mr. S dropped to the ground dead with 3 .38 caliber handgun bullets lodged in his chest. The entirety of his holding cell was searched for evidence of a shooter, but none was found. The Exposition Gun remains in a locked plastic case in Storage Site 23. Aside from regular cleaning and maintenance, it is used under controlled circumstances to creatively gather intelligence about further SCP activity. In the event of the site being compromised, personnel are allowed to destroy the Exposition Gun at their own discretion, should it fall into the wrong hands.
Good grief, said Jotaro Kujo, as he, his grandfather Joseph Joestar, and the rest of their allied group of stand users hid from the light of day in the shadows of a ruined building. Outside, amorphous semi-humanoid monstrosities roam free in search of life. How could this have happened? Jotaro's family had been on some bizarre adventures, but this one was proving to be the most bizarre of all. The sun, now designated SCP-001, was burning with intense bright red light and an anomalous level of heat. It beat down on the world below like an evil and sadistic god of the desert. The entire world was at the mercy of these oppressive solar rays, and high temperatures were just the beginning. From the looks of it, any living thing exposed to the rays of SCP-001 would quickly dissolve into a horrible gooey substance
that would ooze towards other organisms in an attempt to absorb them into its biomass. Basically, it was like a zombie apocalypse straight out of an easy-bake oven. The Stardust Crusaders had been passing through this city on their globe-trotting adventure, only to find that morning had brought with it a disaster the likes of which had never been seen before. By mid-afternoon, when the sun was highest in the sky, most of the people had already been converted into slime monsters, and those who fled into the shadows found themselves relentlessly hunted down and absorbed. Only the stand users of Jotaro's group, who were already on the lookout for strange happenings, had been clever enough to pick up on the situation immediately. They had been the subject of many unusual supernatural attacks over the course of their journey, so the initial anomalous effects of SCP-001 seemed to be another routine brush with an enemy.
Hey, Jotaro, this has to be the effect of an enemy stand, right?
Joseph said.
What? Are you stupid or something, old man?
Spat Jean-Pierre Polnareff. The Frenchman was ever the impulsive one, and he always found something to complain about when a woman wasn't present. He was selectively polite, one might say. It was fitting given the fact that his stand, Silver Chariot, took the form of a sword-wielding knight, and its reaction speed was the fastest of any of the Stardust Crusaders.
You think one stand could do all this?
Polnareff was adamant about making his point. Jotaro's fellow high school classmate, Noriaki Kakyoin, was the next to speak.
Polnareff, keep your voice down. We can't be sure it's not a stand, but either way, those flesh monsters are looking for us.
Kakyoin was younger than Polnareff, but tended to carry himself with more composure. This likely had something to do with the fact that Hierophant Green was the group's most technical stand, and often used for reconnaissance.
What do you think, Avadol?
Kakyoin continued.
You're the expert here.
Muhammad Avdol, a fortune teller who possessed a stand that controls fire, Magician's Red, was often knowledgeable about the supernatural.
A stand this powerful would have to be limited in the range it could affect,
Avdol said.
What we have to do is get further away from this area. Then we'll see if this strange sunlight fades. But what if the user is following us?
Joseph interjected.
How will we know we aren't putting more people at risk? Mr. Joestar, we can't win this battle without more information,
Avdol replied. Kakyoin, your Hierophant Green has the longest range. Send it to scout for a place outside of the stand's reach. Our stand shouldn't be visible to those transformed humans, and the heat from the sunlight won't affect something without mass. Friendly reminder to those of you at home unfamiliar with the properties of stands. Stands are spectral entities formed from the soul of the user, and are essentially superpowered ghosts without physical presence. As such, they won't be affected by SCP-001 the way a living thing would. Now back to this bizarre adventure.
Right,
Kakyoin nodded.
Hierophant Green!
Kakyoin summoned his stand and began threading Hierophant Green's long, stretchy body throughout the ruins as far as it could go. The young man concentrated, looking through the eyes of his stand. As Kakyoin and his stand searched for the end of the anomalous effects of SCP-001, Polnareff continued to complain as usual. So, we're still not sure what's going on, but from what I've heard, you're already calling it a stand? Did I get that right, Avdol? Polnareff grumbled.
Do you have any better ideas, Polnareff?
Avdol said sternly.
Iggy!
Barked Iggy, the last member of the Stardust Crusaders. He was a Boston Terrier who commanded a sand-manipulating stand known as the Fool. Iggy didn't really have much to add to the conversation, but he liked to be heard.
Listen, said Joseph Joestar. When I was a younger man, I actually did go head-to-head with some terrifying beings who might be able to turn people into monsters like these. But every single time, the sun was the enemy of those guys.
Nobody is interested in hearing your stories right now, old man,
Jotaro chided his grandfather. Meanwhile, far from where the Stardust Crusaders were hiding out, Hierophant Green was reaching the limits of its effective range and seeing no sign of an end to the anomalous effects. Kakyoin was baffled. Could it be true that the entire world had been affected by the frightening ability of the sun, now that it was SCP-001? If that was true, then the apocalyptic wasteland was more than just the work of an enemy stand user. This would mean that the sun itself had become the enemy of all life. Kakyoin wondered about his family back in Japan. Would they manage to survive this terrible catastrophe? He couldn't help but hope that there was some way out of this utter devastation, even though the information gathered by his stand told him otherwise. Kakyoin withdrew Hierophant Green and brought his companions up to speed. However hard it was to accept, the world as they knew it was gone with the daybreak. Polnareff was beside himself in sadness, while Avdol and Joseph exchanged a meaningful glance. For once, Iggy's bad attitude subsided, and the dog simply whispered. Only Jotaro remained determined to carry on.
Good grief, would you all get a hold of yourselves? Jotaro said. We'll remain human as long as we aren't caught in that light, so I'll use Star Platinum to tunnel our way underground.
Jotaro's Star Platinum was a short-range stand, but in terms of raw power, it was off the charts. Its punches could easily tunnel through solid rock and create a subterranean passageway for the Crusaders to retreat to a safer area.
Attaboy, Jotaro! Joseph exclaimed. We'll make our daring escape mole style!
Jotaro nodded and called Star Platinum, shouting its signature battle cry of
Ora ora!
Star Platinum smashed through the earth below, instantly creating the entrance to a tunnel. At that exact moment, every flesh monster in the nearby vicinity turned its attention towards the sound. The stand users had to move quickly, because they would soon be completely surrounded.
Oh my god!
Shouted Joseph in his usual way, as a couple of flesh monsters began to enter the ruined building. Luckily, Polnareff and Avdol sprung into action and summoned Silver Chariot and Magician's Red to fend off the flesh zombies. Silver Chariot delivered an inescapably fast fury of sword strikes to one of the monsters, while Magician's Red burned them away with its supernatural flames. The two men high-fived at a job well done. Just then, the wall next to them burst open, revealing a new monster and caused the sun's rays to enter into the building's interior. With split-second intuition, Avdol pushed Polnareff further into the shadows. The Frenchman tumbled backwards into the hole Jotaro made, and before he could get his bearings, he caught a glimpse of Avdol being absorbed into the monster's mass.
Avdol!
He cried out, but it was too late. Avdol was already starting to show signs of transformation into an ooze-like zombie himself. The fortune teller breathed in deep and called the name of his stand with determined fervor.
Magician's Red!
Before Avdol could be fully taken by the slime, he unleashed the totality of his firepower on every zombified lifeform within range, its destructive heat enhanced by the dryness of the atmosphere. Avdol turned back to his friends and gave them a heartfelt thumbs up before he disappeared into the flames. Polnareff cried out for his friend again with tears in his eyes, but Kaioken and Joseph grabbed him and made their way deeper into the tunnel. As badass and heroic as it was, Avdol's sacrifice wouldn't keep those hordes of monsters at bay for long. While Kaioken and Joseph dragged a crying Polnareff through the underground escape route, Jotaro and Iggy were already at the front of the group, using a combination of Star Platinum's digging ability and Iggy's sand manipulation to stabilize the tunnel. The Stardust Crusaders were deep beneath the surface of the Earth now, so a cave-in could be a real problem.
We have to go back!
Polnareff shrieked.
Avdol needs our help!
It's too late, Polnareff, Joseph said with grim conviction.
Avdol is gone. We don't know that for sure,
Polnareff carried on.
Let me go!
But Kaioken and Joseph held on to Polnareff tightly and continued to drag him down the passageway, hoping not to lose him to this daytime nightmare as well. On the inside, Jotaro was shaken by the loss of one of his companions, but nobody would have been able to tell by looking at his stoic exterior. He was solely focused on keeping the tunnel expanding, so that he and the remaining Crusaders could survive this ordeal together. Suddenly, a noise from the opposite end of the passageway put the group on high alert. Like a flood of liquefied horror, the flesh monsters had begun pouring themselves into the pit and were now moving towards the group, inch by inch.
Oh no!
Joseph shouted. He loosened his grip on Polnareff, and both of them immediately booked it towards Jotaro and Iggy. Kaioken, however, stood in place and braced himself. He didn't like it, but he knew what he had to do. Right now, his stand had the ability to stop these things, but first he had to slow them down.
Emerald Splash!
Kaioken shouted, prompting Hierophant Green to launch a stream of concussive green gemstones from its hands. As planned, the attack slowed the slime monsters down. Kaioken was then able to put the second part of his plan into effect. He identified what appeared to be a face on the monster in front and sent Hierophant Green to make its way inside the creature's body. This was his stand's most terrifying ability, and one Kaioken seldom used. Hierophant Green had the power to control the bodies of other physical entities from within. Once his stand had established control, Kaioken forced the massive ooze to stop in place, instantly plugging the tunnel and preventing the rest of the monsters from getting any closer. How long could he keep this up? He didn't know. But because of Hierophant Green's properties as a remote stand, Kakyoin was able to run and rejoin Jotaro and the others at the front of the tunnel. The tether between himself and his stand was stretching farther by the minute, but he dared not let his control of the oozing entity slip, lest he and his companions suffer the same fate as Avdol. Before long, Jotaro felt a different sort of surface at the front of the tunnel. Rather than earth, it was brick. With one punch from Star Platinum, he smashed through and into what appeared to be an abandoned subway station. The power was still on, though most of the lights had faded. It was fortunate that there was no natural sunlight in this place. As everyone's eyes adjusted to the light, the stand users crossed the tracks and made their way onto the somewhat safer area. Polnareff drifted over to the magazine kiosk, searching for signs of anyone behind the counter. There was nobody here, and Iggy soon helped himself to some of the coffee-flavored chewing gum at the concession stand. The dog couldn't resist his favorite snack after all. Jotaro stood by the tracks as if waiting for a train, while Kakyoin did his best to maintain his hold on the monsters further behind them in the tunnel. With a bit of searching, Joseph found a large portable music player designed for CDs, also known as a boombox. With the use of his divination-focused stand, Hermit Purple, Joseph created purple thorny vines which weaved their way into the wires of the device and generated a psychic message. Hermit Purple could usually be counted on to provide more detail about a situation, but its powers were limited by the device used to gain the information. In this case, the CD within the boombox had a copy of the Beatles' famous 1969 album Abbey Road, so Hermit Purple's message to Joseph came out as a garbled but oddly appropriate rearrangement of the lyrics to Here Comes the Sun. Little darling, I see their faces slowly melting. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been alright. Here comes the sun, doo-doo-doo. Here comes the sun, and I say, I feel I've been slowly melting. Sun, 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 here it comes. Oh my God, Joseph said to himself quietly. Just then, Kakyoin felt the body that Hierophant Green was controlling give way. Apparently the pressure of so many other ooze monsters had been too much for it to hold back, and now these things were barreling down the tunnel towards the Crusaders. Rather than pulling Hierophant Green back completely, Kakyoin unleashed his Emerald Splash over and over again in an attempt to force a cave-in, but the creatures were too resilient, and their ooze-like structures meant they could squeeze past mere rocks in their path. Kakyoin told the rest of the group that it was time to leave, and as if on cue, a train began to pull into the station. Unfortunately, the crazy train pulled into the station with several cars full of ooze zombies ready to grab the poor team and drag them into the sun. There was no way out but up the stairs, back into the sunlight they had done everything possible to escape from. As Polnareff, Jotaro, Joseph, and Iggy did their best to fend off the attacking creatures using their stands, Kakyoin made one last-ditch attempt to contain the monsters. He stretched Hierophant Green down to its most basic form, a series of long, green, fibrous strings, and created a net to ensnare the creatures. While the oozes could still seep its way through its wiry form, Kakyoin rigged his stand to set off an emerald splash on every bit of anomalous goo that made it past the net's defenses. It was a sustainable and effective wall against the monsters, using both the tensile strength of the stand and its energy attacks to effectively stymie their progress. There was only one problem. In order to maintain this perfect defense, Kakyoin would have to stay behind.
I'll hold them! Go on without me!
Kakyoin said.
Kakyoin!
Joseph shouted, as the rest of them ran as fast as they could out of the subway. Having effectively lost 2 members of the group, the Stardust Crusaders were low in spirits. Looking up through the subway exit, they could see that they would soon be in contact with the sunlight, meaning that even their survival would become unlikely. But Jotaro wasn't about to give in. He grabbed Iggy and held the dog out in front of him.
All right, Iggy, it's now or never. Either show us you can be a team player or be the first to turn into one of those blob monsters.
Iggy struggled in Jotaro's grip, but to no avail. The dog knew that Jotaro was serious, so in an act of self-preservation that was unusually generous of him, Iggy used the Fool to stir up the sand on the ground above into a gigantic shady sand dome. Moments later, he compressed it into a compact fortress of sand, Iggy's moving castle, as it were. No light could enter this fortress, but because of the granular nature of sand, oxygen was flowing freely. The Stardust Crusaders now had a method of travel in this world torn apart by SCP-001. Of course, there was still the matter of dealing with the flesh creatures outside. Even if the fortress of sand could move across the surface without sunlight getting in, the surrounding oozes could still impede its progress. With the help of all three of Jotaro, Joseph, and Polnareff's stands, a solution soon became clear. Joseph would use Hermit Purple on the sand to divine the location of any approaching threats, while Jotaro and Polnareff would patrol the outside of the miniaturized fortress with Star Platinum and Silver Chariot, respectively. That way, whenever a flesh creature got too close, the two attack-type stands could unleash full-force barrages to knock them away. The next thing to do was for Iggy to increase the speed of the sand construct by adding wheels to it. It was like a gigantic sand monster truck zooming through the ruins, with a platinum brawler and a silver knight repelling anything that came too near. Once Iggy gained enough velocity with the Fool, Joseph used Hermit Purple to discern the location of a bit of rubble shaped conveniently like a ramp. The sandcastle vaulted off the ramp and into the air, while Iggy augmented his creation once again with a pair of gigantic gliding wings. Now, they were soaring. Out of the reach of the flesh monsters, Joseph and Polnareff shared sympathies over the loss of their two important friends. Avdol and Kaukin had both bravely given themselves to protect the team, and none of the Crusaders would be here if it wasn't for them. Jotaro focused on helping Iggy pilot the sand glider, using Star Platinum to kick the ground whenever the vehicle got too low. Nobody was sure what they would encounter next in the daybreak, or what bizarre adventures were yet to unfold, but they had each other, and for now, that was enough.
You all remember the story, one of the most epic, sprawling, action-packed tales in the entire multiverse, the saga of Pietro Wilson and the SCP-5000 exclusion suit. He went through an unimaginable hell to reset the universe and save the world from an SCP Foundation that had seemingly lost its mind, in an unprecedented international mass containment breach that had the stated goal of wiping out the human race. It was one of the most horrifying possible timelines imaginable, and we should all be thankful for Pietro's struggle and sacrifice. Or should we? After all, there are two sides to every story, each with its own perspective and insight. One side of the coin was Pietro, a man willing to do anything to return normalcy to the human race. On the other side was a familiar yet wholly unexpected face, SCP-682. In our original telling of the SCP-5000 Odyssey, you may have noticed passing mentions of SCP-682 here and there. It was one of those thousands of anomalies unleashed across the world to wreak terrible havoc on all of us. But what you may not have known is that SCP-682 was one of the few intelligent entities that weren't surprised by the sudden turn taken by the SCP Foundation, or indeed the world at large. SCP-682 knew something like this was inevitable, as soon as human beings found out about it. That's right, it. The entity behind all the pain and misery of SCP-5000. And today, thanks to the inner thoughts of none other than SCP-682 itself, you will understand what it's all about, and why the SCP Foundation took such severe action against it. But in order to truly understand this, and the role that SCP-682 plays in it, we need to get back to the beginning. Two Foundation projects with wildly different research implications, Project Numa and Project Demerong. The first involved using cutting-edge technological advancements to map out the human psychosphere and understand the psychic web that connects us all. The latter was an attempt to explore what happens after death, and perhaps even gain some control over its processes. But as is often the case when mankind dabbles in arcane questions better left unexplored, the SCP Foundation didn't like the answers they found. The rotten fruit of Project Demerong was SCP-2718, also known as What Happens After Death. If you're already familiar with this one, then there's a good chance a chill just went down your spine. It's widely considered one of the most disturbing anomalous discoveries ever, and a member of the O5 Council who'd already experienced it decided to submit himself for eternal torture at the hands of SCP-106, just so he could avoid it. According to SCP-2718, after death, there is no heaven, no hell, and no oblivion. The human consciousness endures in the most horrifying way possible. It remains bonded to its decaying earthly body, feeling the slow agony of rot for eternity. Unable to speak, unable to move, unable to scream, but fully aware as everything they once were putrefies and withers away. And cremation isn't an escape here, it's worse. Every molecule of ash your body is reduced to will cry out in silence, echoing around the empty halls of your fragmented soul forever. With something this utterly horrifying, the natural follow-up questions are, why does this happen? And for the love of all that is good and pure on this earth, is there any way to stop it? This brings us to Project Numa, the one that's even more closely associated with the events of SCP-5000. The Foundation's attempts to map out the human psychosphere resulted in a world-shattering discovery. Something was living in there. The entity, the powerful nameless creature we've been referring to as It. It lives in so many of our heads, watching, waiting, and of course, feeding. The main question here is, on what? Prior to the discovery that changed everything in the world of SCP-5000, the only being that truly knew was SCP-682 itself, melting away in its acid tank, bound by reinforced restraints, hurting, bored, hating. Imagine for a second what the life of SCP-682 is like. It isn't the most dangerous of the anomalies out there. There are Devourer of Worlds and Scarlet Kings more happy to crush our whole world in their claws, nor is it the most sadistic. A being like SCP-106 offers a far more painful death than being quickly mauled, crushed, or eaten by the hard-to-destroy reptile. And despite this, the Foundation expends countless resources in trying to murder it on a constant basis. It has been burnt, melted, eaten alive, drowned, slashed, beaten, dissected, suffocated, erased from existence, set upon by nightmare creatures, torn to shreds on an atomic level, and even more terrible termination attempts than you can possibly imagine. We've made several videos on the subject, and even we have barely scratched the surface of the pain inflicted on SCP-682 by the SCP Foundation. Even in its default state, SCP-682 is constantly submerged in hydrofluoric acid, eating away at it forever. Does that remind you of anything else we've been talking about? You might wonder how SCP-682 can withstand this level of constant torture without completely losing its mind. To put it very simply, 682 takes a great deal of satisfaction in knowing that what every human has to contend with after death is far worse than the tortures it expected to endure at the pathetic hands of these doomed human fools. It already knew what Project Numa discovered. It already knew about It, the entity. It felt the constant suffering of the teeming billions of dead in the world around it, and it found it disgusting. An interesting choice of words, and a favorite for SCP-682, but also for the captured SCP Foundation agent Samuel Ross during SCP-5000. As we discussed briefly in our SCP-5000 coverage, something happened that aligned the perspectives of the SCP Foundation with that of the monstrous reptile that they had taken such pleasure in tormenting. What on earth could cause the protectors of humanity to suddenly change their tune like this? There are other little clues embedded in Pietro's terrifying SCP-5000 experience. You may remember a strange and frightening scene where a Foundation field commander went down a row of Foundation soldiers, stabbing each of them with a large combat knife, and none of them reacted. Until one did, at which point his comrades set upon him like mad dogs and killed him, displaying an uncharacteristic level of swift brutality. And then there are the classified files from the O5 Council and the Ethics Committee, led by Chairman Odongo Tejani. It goes without saying that the O5 Council and the Ethics Committee don't really see eye to eye on anything, but the results of Project Numa changed that. The following is classified conversation between a member of the O5 Council, namely O5-1, and Chairman Tejani, trying to comprehend the horror of their discovery. My hands shake as I hold the document. This is confirmed? He nods. We got the report from Numa's staff yesterday. It's everyone. Even us? Even us, Tejani. To think I'd find myself agreeing with that damn lizard. What do we do? You know what we have to do. We'll have to disseminate a cure, I think, among personnel before we get things underway. It'll try to stop us otherwise. God help us, one. Don't be like that, Tejani. That's It talking. And one more incredibly telling quote from a member of the SCP Foundation picked up by Pietro Wilson during SCP-5000. "Once you realize you're not supposed to feel pain, there's nothing to be afraid of anymore." Is it all coming together now? While each participant here only has a part of the puzzle between us all, we can see the full picture. The entity It has inhabited the human psychosphere for as long as we've existed. It's a kind of metaphysical parasite, attached to the entire human race. And what it feeds on seems to be the after effects of pain. And like all efficient parasites, like a tapeworm that induces hunger in its victim so that it can have more food delivered unto itself, the entity cleverly perpetuates its own food source. That's right. It is the very cause of all pain. Humanity was never actually meant to feel it. It's a lie we've told ourselves. Well, not quite something we told ourselves, but something it told us. It induced pain and tricked us all into believing that it was a natural component of our existence. All the while, it fed on us, sustained itself on the suffering that it had seeded within our hearts and souls. The Foundation discovered this and was horrified. But of course, the pain it caused for the living was only part of the equation. Through the revelations of Project Damarung, another thing that SCP-682 was able to know intuitively, we can complete this puzzle and find the terrible truth. The truth being that it is not only behind the suffering we experience in life, but SCP-2718, the even greater suffering we experience in death. For millennia, it has groomed humanity into a perfect all-you-can-eat buffet of dismal pain and suffering. And until recently, they'd been so blissfully ignorant of the horrible fate that awaited them on the other side. The Foundation saw only one solution to this problem, but it certainly wasn't a nice one. In order to save themselves and all of humanity from a truly wretched eternity, they'd need to distribute a cure among themselves. The mimetic key phrase, "harden your hearts," and then go about exterminating every human being still infected by it. Only that would presumably purge the monster from the psychosphere forever, and grant humanity both painless lives and restful deaths. It was a horrible thing done for the best of reasons. The cured Foundation personnel started to notice the horrible background noise of suffering all around them. They now understood how the reptile felt. To call all of this disgusting would be a grave understatement. If anything could help them execute this plan of mass mercy killing, it would be SCP-682. A scaly survivor in disguise all along. SCP-682 was surprised to see the day arrive. Alarms went off across the containment site. His acid tank was drained, his restraints unlocked. A group of unarmed, unprotected researchers entered the room. He saw into their eyes. They'd changed. They were free. And for the first time in decades, he was free too. They explained to him that they'd been acquainted with his old enemy, the entity It. They understood his malice, his disdain. For once they were suddenly joined in a shared goal. They needed to kill them all. They needed to purge the entity from the psychosphere forever. In the words of the Foundation researchers, they would need to exterminate everyone who was infected, and SCP-682 would need to help. The hard-to-destroy reptile, relishing the opportunity, replied,
"I will do my part."
And for a brief window of glorious time, it was free. With no threat of recapture, it rampaged through the world, gleefully slaughtering scores of people. It was in its element, taking part in the mass extermination of the infected. Every dead body added to the pile was another blow struck against it. Soon enough, the world would be disgusting no longer. But of course, that's not how this story ended. It had a trump card, Pietro Wilson. It guided him all the way, dragging him from nightmare to nightmare, until he was eventually able to reset the world and erase the discovery made by Project Numa. The slate was wiped fully clean, and because of it, we are forever ignorant of the terrible fate awaiting us all after death, and the monster lurking in our psychosphere that feeds off of every morsel of suffering. You can thank Pietro Wilson for that nasty little gift. Only one entity truly remembered what had happened. SCP-682, of course. They had their chance to save themselves, and they ruined it. So close, yet so far. From that day onward, SCP-682 found the Foundation not only disgusting, but disappointing. Screams filled the cold night air.
drowned out by the panicked gunshots and the vicious growl of something inhuman. A being from who knows where, a creature that the agents surrounding it were woefully underprepared to capture. General McCoy barks at the soldiers to concentrate their fire on the beast. His men, those who hadn't already fallen, turned and trained their guns on the creature. Squeezing their trigger fingers, bullets spewed out of their weapons, a hail of gunfire that sped towards their target, only to miss, as it suddenly vanished from the spot it had been standing only a split second earlier. Their bullets passed through the thin air left in its wake, shredding several nearby trees. One of the men threw his gun to the ground, turned heel, and sprinted away as fast as he could. He hadn't known what he was signing on for when he was recruited by a shadowy up-and-coming organization. He'd just been flattered to be headhunted for his combat skill, and agreed to be one of the new organization's first field agents. If he'd known it would result in him facing off against a demon near a rural road in Guatemala, then he would have stayed in the regular military. The fleeing agent suddenly stopped in his tracks, instantly feeling sick. It was the most indescribable type of sickness, worse than any he had ever felt in his entire life. He dropped to the ground, his pants from running away replaced with heaves as his entire body seemed to have suddenly turned against him. His head was burning. At first he thought he'd run too fast too quickly, and was overheating underneath his military fatigues and helmet. But he was no slouch, recruited for being in peak physical condition such as he was. Never in his life had the agent ever felt this bad. The heat from his forehead was unbearable, a fever running rampant as his vision began to blur. Everything was spinning, that unsettling imbalance that comes with severe nausea rapidly taking hold of the fallen agent. Then the monster came back. Through unfocused eyes, he looked up at the tall, featureless face of the creature as it looked down at him. He was helpless, hurling and shuddering, barely able to stand. If someone had brought a Geiger counter with them, it would be ticking loudly and frequently if they held it near the agent. And that, somehow, was about to be the least of his problems. The creature opened up its mouth, the only facial feature that occupied its head. Past its few remaining teeth was a milky blue orb. The same thing that had been visible right before the creature itself wasn't. As the agent, from his place on the ground, caught sight of the pale eyeball in the monster's throat, something started pulling his body in on itself. It was like falling, except gravity was acting on different parts of his body at different speeds at different times. His arms and legs folded inwards towards his center of mass, making the agent scream out in pain as his body collapsed. He folded into himself like origami, piece by agonizing piece, until there was nothing left. Hearing the man scream, General McCoy and the others broke through the tree line, flashlight beams illuminating the creature. The general yelled again for his men to shoot it, trying to hide his fear with animal rage. It snarled at them as they raised their guns once more, then leaped towards them, ready for another kill. In the years to come, the successors to these men and their fallen colleagues would be the world's foremost experts in situations like this. The capture and containment of anomalies would one day be a more streamlined process rather than the bloodbath currently unfolding in the small Guatemalan town. Dying at the hands of what locals had thought to be a demon were some of the earliest precursors to the SCP Foundation. Humble beginnings, indeed. The creature was eventually captured by the early precursor version of what would one day be the SCP Foundation. At this time in their history, the organization had far fewer resources and reach than they would one day have at their disposal. They didn't even have the SCP numerical designation system that has since become synonymous with the organization and the various anomalies they keep contained. As a result, this so-called demon was originally classified as number 86243AR-001. However, it would later be known as SCP-001, or one of the anomalies to share that designation at least. SCP-001 itself was an abnormally thin humanoid creature. With gray-brown skin, its emaciated bone and muscle structure didn't match any known species. It sported dark claws at the tips of its arms, with both legs terminating in similar sharp black points rather than paws or feet. Most striking was its face. or rather, its lack of one. The creature's head was spherical, with a lipless mouth reaching halfway around its circumference. Within was a maw of 21 teeth, each spaced randomly apart and either chipped, broken, or rotting. It possessed one eye, or what was at least believed to be an eye, in the form of a large milky blue sphere in its throat, with no pupil or iris. As was discovered in initial testing by Dr. Herman Keter, for whom the ubiquitous Keter class designation was named, SCP-001 was able to create micro-singularities using its single milky blue eye. It could deploy these as a means of teleporting itself out of harm's way, or for offensive attacks that could cause a human body to collapse in on itself. These singularities often also produced the nasty side effect of emitting lethal amounts of deadly radiation that could not only cause damage to the surrounding area, but also would fatally poison anyone nearby. As a result, it is believed one of these micro-singularities was responsible for the untimely death of Dr. Keter. However, Keter's research into SCP-001 was at least able to produce solutions for keeping it contained. It was discovered that SCP-001 could not teleport through lead and would display signs of extreme sickness and fear when exposed to high levels of heat and humidity or bright flashing lights. Strobe lights were used to induce this sickened state, and in this state, the creature was unable to form harmful singularities. Dr. Keter's death also ushered in the aforementioned creation of the Keter class designation for anomalous creatures or artifacts that are extraordinarily tough to keep safely contained. In fact, if any of this account is to be believed, the very discovery and capture of SCP-001 was the impetus for the entire SCP Foundation's approach to researching and containing anomalies. In the days before the likes of Dr. Kondraki or Dr. Clef, before infamous anomalies such as SCP-682, the hard-to-destroy reptile, or SCP-096, the Shy Guy, were even known about, things were, well, pretty uneventful for the newly formed Foundation, as you can probably imagine. But none exemplified this better than Harold Woodeu, an uninteresting man living an uneventful life, or as uneventful as one could get when their job was working for the Foundation. During this crucial period of the SCP Foundation's early history, as the Anomalous Research and Containment Organization was taking its first steps towards protecting the people of the world, Harold was finding himself bored already with his work. Harold was a senior archivist at a small site in Sloth's Pit, Wisconsin. This was before the Foundation had secret facilities situated all over the world, and even the infamous Site-19 as it is today had yet to be established. For now, it was known only as ADRX-19, the oldest Foundation site on record. And records were Harold's entire working life. He was in charge of maintaining the earliest reports of anomalous activity and the inner workings of the fledgling Foundation. One day, Harold received a letter from ADRX-19. Unfamiliar with the designation, he ran a check through the records and discovered that the site had been established before the Foundation had even gotten its name. The letter contained an update for the senior archivist. Having grown obsolete in its own age, ADRX-19 was being closed for good, and that meant all of the anomalous entities and objects stored there would soon be shipped off to be stored elsewhere. The first package arrived at the site Harold was stationed at not long after. He walked briskly out to meet the delivery officer as he wheeled the large wooden crate through the bay doors. It didn't take the archivist long to realize what exactly he had now been given the ownership of and charged with protecting. The crate even came complete with relevant case files to accompany it. Stamped on one side of the box was a series of numbers and letters that shocked Harold when he read them. SCP-001. He exchanged a confused look with the man who had delivered the anomaly, who just laughed when he saw Harold's expression. "You didn't hear?" he asked. "SCP-001 is dead." The creature's death had come on the heel of a number of significant changes made by the Foundation higher-ups. These decisions were ultimately both the direct result of the encounter with SCP-001 in Guatemala, and were also changes that would ultimately shape the Foundation into its modern iteration. The first of these was the introduction of the numerical designation system, providing each anomaly with an SCP number. Formerly designated as number 86243AR-001, The creature that was captured and researched by Dr. Keter was announced to be reclassified as SCP-001-COG. Originally, the number attached to each SCP denoted the order in which they were encountered by the Foundation. However, the Overseer Council believed this posed a security risk, offering too much information about their operations to any potential adversaries. As a result, the use of SCP-001 designation started to be applied in a slightly different way. A number of anomalies were then grouped under the umbrella designation of SCP-001. Some of these were real anomalies, and amongst the earliest that the Foundation encountered. Others were entirely fake, and used as a cover for the real SCP-001. Nobody, not even within the Foundation itself, was ever told exactly how many files fell under the SCP-001 umbrella, or indeed, which was the real one. The anomalies included the Gate Guardian, a towering colossus of pure energy wielding a flaming sword, believed to be the biblical angel guarding the Garden of Eden, the Scarlet King, an extra-dimensional tyrant that longs to conquer our reality, a group of 36 individuals capable of neutralizing anomalies. Even the SCP Foundation itself is considered one potential SCP-001. And among them is also the creature from Guatemala, otherwise known as the Prototype. The same creature whose inhuman bones were now in a box before Harold. The senior archivist had long heard legends about what exactly SCP-001 might be. It was a question often whispered among Foundation staff who were curious what the first anomaly might be, but didn't have the security clearance to know the truth. Rumors spread that SCP-001 was more powerful than any other anomalies in Containment, that the capture or discovery of it was either the reason for the Foundation ever forming, or it was one of their greatest failures, meant to be kept their closest guarded secret. Something far too terrible to comprehend. You might think that now being presented with an answer would give Harold relief. So many wonders and haunting queries about SCP-001 were put to rest. But instead, as he opened up the wooden crate and looked at the pile of strange bones inside, it had the opposite effect. None of it was the interesting answer that Harold and many others had hoped for. If anything, it was a huge disappointment. All that speculation surrounding the mystery of SCP-001, what it was, where it had come from, why it was kept so secret. Was this the answer? It was just the first thing that the SCP Foundation had put into a box. According to the Foundation's own internal reports, the prototype monster had been found lying still in its containment chamber during a routine inspection. It wasn't moving at all. Even armed guards couldn't get a reaction from the creature. The anomaly wasn't breathing, its heart having slowed to a stop. Little was known about the creature's biology, but even then, nothing could be done to resuscitate it. As far as anyone could tell, the anomaly known as SCP-001-COG had died of old age, after exhibiting movement that got gradually slower and weaker, and even less hostile behavior over the course of the previous decade since its initial capture. But yet Harold was still dissatisfied with the knowledge that this was SCP-001. He became fixated on the case surrounding it. Studying the files he was charged with moving to storage, he learned of the few ways the creature's discovery had influenced the early Foundation. For example, the death of Dr. Keter being the reason for the use of Keter class in their terminology. Still, that didn't feel nearly as important as Harold and others had speculated that SCP-001 would be. There had to be something more to it, and for weeks following the arrival of the creature's bones, Harold could not stop thinking about it. Something about all this didn't sit right with him. The secrecy that the Foundation shrouded SCP-001 in seemed like overkill for just a monster. The organization had seen far worse than the likes of the prototype in the many years since. At the time, perhaps it had seemed like the most dangerous anomaly the Foundation had encountered. If it really was the first, then technically at that time, it would have been the most dangerous if there were no others to compare it to. One night, Harold ventured into the archive and opened up the box containing the creature's bones using a crowbar. He had to know, had to understand exactly what was so important about this being. Cracking the wooden crate open, he removed the skull to examine it. The Foundation hadn't even had a chance to figure out what exactly the creature was, or where it had originated from. All they knew was it could produce microsingularities and lethal doses of radiation. Beyond that, the only other details came from the Guatemalan locals who had encountered it first. They had called it a demon. Perhaps it was. The Foundation would never know for certain, and it seemed to Harold that they didn't care to know now that SCP-001 was dead, and didn't seem to care much before then either. They were more than happy to just discard it. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was meant to be something important about the creature. Harold couldn't help it. The whispers surrounding SCP-001 all indicated it was meant to be something more significant than a cast-aside pile of bones. The underwhelming reality he was being presented with didn't match the idea of SCP-001. Harold examined the skull closely in his hands, turning it around and around as he tried to maybe spot something. Some important detail that everyone else in the Foundation had failed to notice, or some of the puzzle that would explain what was so important about this creature, and yet, the more he looked, the less he learned. Alas, poor SCP-001, he said aloud, paraphrasing Hamlet. Of course, what Harold didn't know, didn't possess the clearance to know, was that this wasn't the only SCP-001. Maybe the Foundation's lack of interest in the creature's remains was all part of their plan to keep the real SCP-001 a secret. Where Harold only saw a box of bones and a disappointing answer to so many burning questions, the SCP Foundation saw their system working exactly as intended. The SR-47 sniper rifle slotted together effortlessly. Even after so many years of combat usage, the weapon was in pristine condition. In all the time Agent Harris had owned the gun, though, the thousands of times she'd fired it, not once had it jammed. And that was fortunate, because she had to move quickly. In a clearing about 300 meters in front of her were their targets. Capable of teleporting in a split second, she needed to be sure that her team would be able to finish the job quickly and efficiently. She looked through the scope slotted onto her rifle and kicked out the bipod, resting it on a tree stump. Now she just had to wait for the signal. She looked all around the marsh, trying her best to spot her fellow agents, but they were also well camouflaged. Even though she knew the exact spot where they would be, she couldn't see anyone. She'd always wanted to see the Himalayas. It had been on her bucket list to climb Mount Everest as a child, but the world had changed since then. Mount Everest was gone. In fact, the majority of Nepal had vanished, replaced by an enormous marsh full almost exclusively of pink ferns and droopy trees that seemed to sag to one side, unable to support their own weight. The most striking natural wonder on planet Earth had been replaced by a landscape that was flat, wet, and alien. Agent Harris curled her finger around the trigger and took aim through her sights. 2 minutes passed. Then the gentle whistle of a sparrow drifted over to her in the humid air. Except, of course, it couldn't be a sparrow. To the best of her knowledge, sparrows had gone extinct. With a snarl of anger, Agent Harris squeezed the trigger. She felt the silent sniper rifle kick her shoulder. If they wanted war, they sure as hell would get it. The destruction of the world began in 2078. Its designation was SCP-Orange-A. And as often happens with these kind of things, no one saw it coming. The SCP Foundation, having dedicated decades to researching potential world-destroying events, was totally blindsided by what happened the day the weasels showed up. Weasels, you ask? That's right. But before we explain, a question for you. Is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? Regardless if you have a clinical mental health issue like depression or anxiety, or if you're just a human who lives in this world who is going through a hard time, therapy can give you tools to approach your life in a very different way. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and more accessible, and this is an important mission because finding a therapist can be really hard, especially when you're limited to the options in your area. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist easier because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/SCP Explained. Clicking that link helps support this channel, but it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. And because finding a therapist is a little like dating, if you don't really fit with that therapist, which is a common thing with therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/SCP-Explained. Thank you again, BetterHelp, for supporting this channel. And now, as we were saying about the weasels. A man called Harlan Stump was the first human to make contact with the weasels. He was the groundskeeper at Site 59. Harlan was making his usual weekly trips around the perimeter of the courtyard on his ride-along lawnmower, watching baseball on his phone all the way when, out of nowhere, the aliens appeared. Just 2 meters in front of him, a squadron of 11 weasels materialized. The weasels, designated SCP-001-B, stand at a minimum of 3 meters tall. With 16 legs and an exoskeleton carapace, they share a resemblance with terrestrial insects. Their bodies are segmented, composed of a head, primary thorax, secondary thorax, tertiary thoracic cloister, abdomen, and tail. With a hard segmented shell covering their backs and no apparent sensory organs, aside from a radula on their heads, they are an intimidating presence. Most striking about them, however, is the most delicate part of their appearance. On their backs, each weasel has an array of flora growing in a kind of garden. It appears that each weasel has a different array of flowers growing from their backs. Understanding the meaning of these gardens can be difficult, but it appears the more extravagant it is, the higher ranking the individual weasel is. The 11 weasels that appeared before Harlan Stump each had a very vibrant garden indeed, but no more so than the weasel held aloft in an ornate palanquin. Harlan Stump stopped mowing and stared at the aliens for approximately 13 seconds, at which point he let out a sigh, pressed play on his baseball game, and continued mowing the lawn. He spent too many years groundskeeping Site 59 to get spooked by anything as harmless as giant teleporting insects. Just 3 more weeks and he would be retired. Until then, he was avoiding nonsense like the plague. Except his phone had disappeared. Harlan stared down at the empty space, confusion knitting his eyebrows together, before looking up and seeing the handset in the hands of the alien sitting on its regal throne. The smartphone made a loud screeching noise, and then all of a sudden began to flick between snippets of YouTube videos, each clip lasting just a couple of seconds. After a moment, Harlan realized that the alien was using the videos to speak to him. The words were being picked out from all these different videos to stitch together a sentence. Barely.
Hi diddly ho, neighborinos.
This is Foundation. Reports indicate Foundation is locally the masters of the universe. Isn't that right, darling? Question mark. Keen to finish his mowing and avoid further nonsense, Harlan had to concede that he should probably talk to these aliens, if only to get his phone back. He told them he liked the gardens on their backs. Why, thank you! Gardening is kind of our thing. Well, quick question. Is your species capable of dying? Harlan gulped. He'd been around long enough to see where this was going. The conversation was brief. Harlan kept glancing at his phone, desperately hoping that these aliens hadn't somehow broken it, and that it hadn't lost his place in the match, until all of a sudden, Harlan Stump disappeared, as did his ride-on lawnmower, his smartphone, and a patch of lawn, replaced by a roughly 10-meter circle of Antarctic ice and snow. No one is certain yet how the weasels are able to do it. All that is known is that they can. The phenomenon came to be known as juxtaposing. Matter from one location could be instantaneously switched with matter from a different location. It is how the weasels first arrived on planet Earth, triggering the event of SCP-001-A. Orange-A lasted for just 2 hours, but it changed the course of humanity forever. On the 29th of April, 2078, 48.52% of the Earth's habitable surface area dematerialized and rematerialized half a kilometer above the South Pole. Cities and towns from all across planet Earth, one by one, disappeared and reappeared in the air above the South Pole, where they promptly fell 500 meters, causing back-to-back seismic events. Washington, D.C., Beijing, and London were targeted first, followed by Tokyo, Delhi, and then a number of capital cities from Europe. This 2-hour window resulted in freak weather events as minus 50-degree pockets of air, kilometers across, replaced the disappearing cities. It is disputed as to who launched the first nuclear warhead, whether it was done by accident, out of fear, or as a strategic attack against a group of weasels. Orange-A was simply too chaotic and destructive for humanity ever to be able to know what happened in that short period of time. The The result, however, was a number of nuclear explosions raging across the planet before the cities in charge of launching them were also transported to the South Pole. While the weasels were capable of experiencing juxtaposition without any apparent physical harm, terrestrial life forms were less fortunate. During the process of juxtaposition, the bonds between each and every cell are broken. While organic life does get transported to the new location, it undergoes immediate liquefaction. Not a single Earth-born life form has been observed surviving a juxtaposition event. In that 2-hour window, 6.9 billion people were killed. Humanity had lost. This event triggered the use of Project Yellow, an emergency evacuation protocol that occurs at the point where the survival of the human race seems to be virtually zero. A small band of specially chosen individuals were evacuated to a pocket dimension, where they were put into cryosleep to wait until the Earth was habitable once again. In the days following the events of Orange-A, the true invasion began. Choosing the Sahara Desert as their arrival point, the weasels started to appear in legions. Millions and millions of them filled the desert sands and went about populating their new planet. But what was their purpose? Well, fortunately, we have been able to salvage a modest amount of data that can inform us of why they're here and what their plans are. The weasel that first appeared to Harlan's stump just outside Site-59 has been designated SCP Orange Prime. It is believed that this weasel, in particular, is their leader. Whether Prime is simply the leader of this colony or the wider species is yet to be confirmed. Security cameras were able to capture the interaction as it took place within Site-59's grounds. In their conversation, Orange Prime explains their purpose to Harlan through YouTube clips on his phone. Long story short, weasels have come from Homeworld Dimension for fulfill a long-standing mutual agreement with Grandma. This is one of many new homes. This is a pretty nice place for weasels. This land is my land, from California to the New York Islands, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for weasels to garden, to farm, to create beauty, to spread good vibes, to cultivate, to remake, to terraform, etc., etc. Since this encounter, no human has been able to get close enough to Orange Prime to engage the weasel in further conversation. This snippet of footage is all that humanity has to understand why this alien species has slaughtered billions of us. 4 months later, Agent Harris lay flat in the marshlands, firing her sniper rifle at the weasels gathering in a clearing ahead of them. Their operation looked like overkill. It always did. It was of utmost importance that they strike quickly and without mercy. Sustained heavy gunfire from all sides, combined with RPG fire and the use of incendiary weapons, made short work of the weasels. All of these weapons were necessary to pierce the heavy armor that covered their backs. But that was the reason it felt like overkill. It felt that way because the weasels never fought back. They would not attack, defend themselves, help their fallen allies, or even beg for their lives. They would simply stand idly by as they were gunned down. That is, until the incendiary grenades arrived. The pink ferns filling the marshlands caught fire and began to curl and smoke heavily. As soon as that happened, the weasels sprung into action, quickly splashing water onto the leaves, trying their best to save the plants. The incendiary grenades were not necessary. They did very little damage to the weasels themselves. The reason the platoons used the grenades was that it was one way they had found to distress their alien invaders in any way. It was a small revenge they could take for the billions of people who had lost their lives over the prior few months. Agent Harris pumped 5 extra shots into the corpse of a weasel before standing down and going to examine her handiwork. They had been hunting Orange Prime. Rumors had suggested that their primary target had been lurking in the Himalayan region, but that had obviously proven to be false. Among all the bodies on the ground, there was no sign of the fearless leader. Frustration boiled in Harris as she kicked a corpse. The thick shell hurt her foot. She must have broken her toe. At that moment, a rustling noise came from the other side of the trees. Soon, dozens more, hundreds more weasels were walking through the marsh. In a split second, her platoon opened fire. Tracer rounds lashed through the trees, and the orange glow of fire danced in every direction. But there were more weasels, many more of them. Agent Harris felt her stomach knot as she fired her rifle into the crowd. There were too many, simply too many. They were going to run out of ammo before they had a chance to shoot down each and every one of them. And she was right. The firefight lasted for 30 minutes before the remaining soldier ran out of ammunition. Dozens of weasel bodies littered the marsh, floating in the water. Dozens more weasels stood encircling the group. That's when the humming started. Whenever a juxtaposition event occurs, it is always accompanied by the weasels humming to themselves. It is unclear whether this is the cause of the juxtaposition or simply a ritual that they perform, but every soldier has come to know that sound, and each one of them fears it in the pit of their stomach. So they started to disappear all around her one by one, replaced by puffs of cold air with snowflakes still gently hanging in the breeze. The human population of planet Earth dwindled as the weasel population bloomed. Large swaths of the planet were terraformed one by one to make room for alien flora. The South Pole became a larger and larger dumping ground for all the detritus that had once been the most celebrated works of the human race. The Mona Lisa was torn and forgotten, buried under many kilometers of concrete, exposed sewage works, and apartment complexes. And the situation only got worse in October. Acting against prior instructions from the Foundation, the Global Occult Coalition launched Project Popgo, a 200-megaton nuclear warhead, directly at a large weasel population center. As the warhead began its descent, the entire sky turned a solid dark blue. Project Popgo immediately fell out of contact, as did all satellites that had been orbiting the planet. The sun, moon, and stars could not be seen. The entire sky was just a uniform dark blue. In a desperate attempt to find out what was going on, the Foundation launched a manned rocket in the direction of Popgo's most recent coordinates. Contact with the rocket was lost after just 9 minutes. This is the most recent known account of events from inside that rocket. All of a sudden, just a few minutes into the flight, warning alarms started going off all over the cockpit. The radar was picking up a solid object blocking their path. Gathering around the readouts, the crew came to a very quick conclusion that the dark blue that had been filling the sky was actually a solid object that was encasing the Earth. But rather than abort the mission, the crew decided to persevere. Having witnessed so much death and destruction over the previous year, they knew they would much rather go out and crashing a rocket into a blue wall than join the billions of humans liquefied in a pile in Antarctica. Closing their eyes, bracing for impact, the crew readied themselves for their now inevitable deaths, but it didn't come. Instead, the rocket was able to force its way through the dense blue object, falling apart as it went. Ground control lost contact with the ship. Nothing. And then a few seconds of audio. The crew had made it. They had somehow managed to pierce their way through the blue shell that was surrounding their planet, and were out into, not space, the Earth. The entire planet had been juxtaposed. Willkommen! Bienvenue! Welcome to an exclusive behind-the-scenes look at Heaven. On May 12, 2588, the entity known as SCP-UBU manifested in Kangastak, Greenland, like something out of the most nightmarish kaiju movie never made. Soon after, there was no more death, but the world was filled with such chaos and despair that humanity longed for that eternal release. From its enormous stomping feet to its cloaca, to its face, featureless save for a gaping, grinning, devouring mouth, the entity was pure malice with all the time in the world. UBU decimated the planet, breaking the spirit of mankind and razing every city to the ground. In the earlier days of UBU's invasion, when there was still dry land and people still wanted to talk to each other rather than joining floating islands of eternal chemically induced slumber, they would commiserate about the shared misery of the state of things. Oh, UBU? My daughter hasn't spoken to me ever since that monster shoved my whole body down her throat, someone would say. Another would pipe up, trying to one-up the first man in sort of a trauma Olympics. Didn't you see me in the news? UBU carried me around for a week, snacking on me every now and then like I was his own personal turkey leg. It was hell. But honestly, part of me felt a little bummed out when he threw me away. Yet another person would chime in, like veterans swapping war stories over a drink at the bar. UBU made me eat a pair of my pants, whole thing, zipper and all. Then he decided he thought that was funny, made me eat pair after pair after pair of them, rinse and repeat. By the time he got bored, I'd eaten probably around 20 pairs. I sort of got a taste for them after that. Everyone on the planet had good reason to despise SCP-UBU, but no one held more hate in his heart for the pale, wicked creature than Dr. Lawrence McLeod. Before the world was turned upside down, sometimes literally, Dr. McLeod was a member of the mysterious O5 Council at the SCP Foundation. To be specific, he was O5-11. But that prestigious position at the Foundation couldn't protect him or his loved ones from the wrath of UBU. When Dr. McLeod was off duty, UBU attacked him and his wife. First, it impaled his wife on a broom handle. Next, it threw Dr. McLeod into an open pool of sewage in the street. Then, it bathed him in the filthy water, using his screaming wife as a scrubbing brush, all the while whistling a horrible little bathtub song. Centuries after that awful experience, as Dr. McLeod watched most of his colleagues give up and choose the closest thing to death in this broken world, he became even more determined to do something about it. On January 14, 3030, Dr. McLeod abandoned the SCPs Naismith and his fellow O5 council members in search of the SCPs Corncrake, an abandoned craft to the southeast. It wasn't an easy journey, rowing all the way there in a lifeboat, never knowing when the great white beast would emerge from the water and choose him as its next unfortunate plaything. He could see the SCPs Corncrake still floating there, untouched. But before he could row any closer, something collided with the lifeboat from below, snapping it in half. Dr. McLeod's stomach dropped at the sight of pale flesh, but it was soon replaced with relief when he saw that the thing that had broken his lifeboat was not, in fact, UBU. It was an injured narwhal, behaving erratically due to its wounds. The culprit was almost certainly UBU. It wasn't content to just torment humans, but instead must have been targeting any life form that could feel pain and fear. In his own words, Dr. McLeod had put it, "At least a mass extinction wouldn't have made it that personal." After the lifeboat broke apart, McLeod swam to the Conrake, exhaustion and cold straining his muscles. It took him 2 hours to reach the abandoned cargo barge and containment site, but eventually he managed to climb up over the side and get on board. There was one very special thing about the Corncrake, the thing that made it worth crossing the ocean in a fragile little lifeboat to find. Every anomaly that made the Ganymede list, the list of anomalies considered too dangerous to abandon, even in an apocalyptic scenario, was contained on the Corncrake. If there was anything left that the Foundation, or anyone else, hadn't tried to use to defeat UBU, it would be on that ship. After taking a little while to recover, Dr. McLeod embarked on an initial exploration of the craft. All the staff were gone, as he had expected. Thankfully, he still had his O5 ID card, and it still worked like a charm, unlocking all of the automated security systems on board. A lot of what he found was in ruins, but some things had survived. He found 10 hominid replicators from SCP-2000 in perfect working order. There was a cage containing the remains of SCP-2845, the deer, though UBU had done significant damage to it. SCP-319, a curious device, was there, contained in a space-locked vacuum chamber. This one was notable for its potential ability to destroy the universe. He found a couple of safe-class anomalies, such as SCP-YEZ, crowd control for the Practical Optimist, and SCP-FNA, the Portable Warehouse. The latter of the two was a portable door frame to a pocket dimension. He also stumbled upon SCP-001, Last Ride of the Day, an old Prometheus Labs prototype of a time machine. And possibly, most importantly, he found SCP-076. The coffin was open, but Abel didn't attack Dr. McLeod. He wasn't consumed with murderous rage and bloodlust, the way he always was before. Instead, he was just sitting on the edge of the ship, silently staring at the sea. When he spotted McLeod, he gave him a small wave and did nothing else. The centuries of a world without death, a world without killing, without victory in battle, had taken its toll on him. For possibly the first time in his eternal life, Abel was depressed. 9 days after he first inspected the Corncrake, McLeod began to formulate a plan. He loaded all of the hominid receptors into SCP-FNA, using a thankfully still working forklift. Next, he was able to unseal the sealed portion of SCP-001, Last Ride of the Day, and get his hands on the details of the anomaly. It read, SCP-001 is capable of temporarily relocating to its relative position 15,000 years prior to activation. This temporal displacement is divergent paradox irrelevant. In other words, a separate timeline is created as a landing point. For example, if an occupant from timeline X were to murder their parents in utero in timeline Y, the Y iteration of the occupant would no longer exist, but the occupant themselves, being from X, would be unharmed. When in a fully active state, SCP-001 deploys a 5-meter-high telescopic antenna that functions as a Coloco wave energy sink. Essentially, Coloco waves could only be produced as a byproduct of the universe suddenly being exterminated, and ZK-class reality failures produce the most Coloco waves. In one of these scenarios, SCP-001 would be able to use these waves to go back in time 15,000 years, effectively resetting reality to a point far before the catastrophe happened. This information allowed him to put his plan together, to resurrect Project Beluga. Step 1. Plant explosive charges around SCP-319. Step 2. Hide anything potentially useful against SCP-UBU inside of SCP-FNA. Step 3. Get into the cockpit with SCP-FNA in tow. Step 4. Raise the Coloco sink. And Step 5. Blow the whole thing up. 3 days later, it was time to put the plan into motion. Dr. McLeod placed the charges around SCP-319's vacuum chamber. There was enough in place to implode the walls of the vacuum chamber. He closed the bulkhead and began deploying the Coloco sink. 10%, 25%, 30%. Suddenly, he could hear a loud crashing sound. The ship began to tilt. Oh no. He could hear the distant sound of menacing giggles. The sink reached 45, 57, but as UBU grew closer, he quickly overrode the system to lower the sink. 45%, 30%, 25%, 10%. UBU grew closer and closer, and as it approached, it began to whistle the tune it once used when it bathed McLeod and his wife in the sewer. UBU began to pound against the blast door, becoming increasingly frustrated as it struggled to break through. Suddenly, another voice cut through the air, an unexpected one. SCP-076 Abel called out to McLeod, encouraging him to carry on while Abel held the beast back. As Abel and UBU engaged in an epic battle, McLeod suddenly remembered something. There was an express deployment module for the Coloco sink. With no time to waste, he activated it. All at once, he hit the detonator, and then the year was 11,970, and the date was February 14th. 13,963 years later, the SCP Foundation discovered something beneath a mound of earth and snow near the northern border of Lapland, Finland. It was a shipping container with a reinforced exterior, the interior of which could only be accessed through a fortified bulkhead on one side. The words SCP-001 were written on the side in black paint. In spite of this, the object was given the designation SCP-8048. A narrow, winding tunnel through the mound of earth and snow was discovered, leading from the door to the outside world. The tunnel had significant wear, clearly having been used as a footpath by someone. But who? Well, on April 12, 1993, the Foundation got their answer. SCP-8048's bulkhead opened, and a man stepped out, snapping his fingers and promptly sealing the door behind him. He was designated Pol 8048. He was a 32-year-old man of French-Canadian descent, answering to the name of Dr. Lawrence McLeod. He made a series of claims that the Foundation found dubious, but noted it in the official file for SCP-8048 just the same. These included, but were not limited to, SCP-8048 is a time machine. He held the office of 05-11 in the year 3030 from an alternate timeline. Said timeline experienced a modified Omega-K class end-of-death scenario that coincided with the invasion of a Tiamat-class anomaly known as SCP-UBU. SCP-UBU was an extremely dangerous and sadistic entity who was capable of, among other things, neutralizing SCP-169 and SCP-682. His timeline's version of the Foundation launched Project Beluga, which resulted in an impossible war with SCP-UBU that lasted 441 years. Pol 8048 deliberately sabotaged SCP-319 to act as a power source for SCP-8048, thus arriving in Lapland in the year 11,970 BCE. SCP-UBU will arrive in Greenland on May 12, 2588. Pol 8048 was able to extend his lifespan by sharing his consciousness between a central computer within SCP-8048 and several thousand bodies created by his personal hominid replicators. Said consciousness sharing was achieved through a book classified in the future as SCP-YEZ. He wishes to assist the Foundation in the termination of SCP-UBU, and has laid out a plan for its termination as outlined in Document 8048-Zeta. There were, of course, concerns about the man's legitimacy. But after McLeod mentioned over 104 specific terms and data points known only to members of the O5 Council, the Foundation was forced to take him at least a little bit seriously. A motion was filed, requesting that Pol 8048 be allowed to assist the Foundation with the termination of SCP-UBU as per document 8048-Zeta. O5-4 voted yay, O5-7 abstained, and the rest of the Council voted nay. The motion failed to pass. A follow-up motion was filed in response, requesting that Pol 8048 be allowed to assist the Foundation with their own strategy to respond to SCP-UBU. O5-1, O5-4, O5-7, and O5-10 abstained from voting. The rest voted nay. The motion failed to pass. On April 14, 1995, Dr. Isaiah Henderson and Pol 8048 sat down for an interview. When asked to state his name, Dr. McLeod also recited a mimetic passphrase that, when spoken by anyone other than O5-11 of past or present, would cause them to burst into flames. The two men were at odds from the beginning. Dr. McLeod expressed dismay and frustration that his proposal was rejected. Meanwhile, Dr. Henderson countered with the insistence that McLeod's proposed plan was rejected for posing an unnecessary risk to the civilian public. They debated for a moment, before Dr. Henderson announced the Foundation's next plan of action. Dr. McLeod was to be terminated. The Foundation would proceed with its plans without him. At that point, Dr. Henderson terminated McLeod as ordered. He didn't count on one thing, though. McLeod was no longer an ordinary man, bound to one body. He hopped into the body of a guard, then into the body of O5-4 to deliver a vital message. He had started this plan alone, and was ready to bring it to a close alone. Project Beluga would continue with or without the Foundation's support. Dr. McLeod returned to the bulkhead, climbing back inside and sealing it behind him. He had hoped to have the Foundation behind him. He had hoped they would be allies in the fight against the greatest evil mankind ever encountered, but they disappointed him. He had waited thousands of years, only for the organization he devoted his life to try and kill him. Well, he wasn't going to go down without a fight. This was bigger than the Foundation, bigger than anyone, and no living person was as equipped to handle UBU as he was. So he resumed Project Beluga as a one-man operation. He issued a mission statement, which read as follows. On May 12, 2588, the entity known as SCP-UBU invaded and pillaged human civilization for no other motivation than cruelty and selfish gratification. Shortly thereafter, Project Beluga was founded as a joint effort between the Global Occult Coalition and the SCP Foundation for the purposes of UBU's destruction. UBU is not merely a threat to human safety, it is an affront to every positive and loving concept in the human consciousness. Rather than our lives, he seeks to destroy our quality of life to sate his own sick desires. Think about it. The taste of ice cream, playing with your dog, the way you felt after your first kiss. That is UBU's sworn enemy. No fate is too cruel for him. No hatred is strong enough. When Project Beluga's charter was signed, 592 GOC officers and Foundation staff were present at the ceremony. Our troops numbered in the hundreds of thousands. I, Dr. Lawrence McLeod, am the only surviving member, and always will be. What I lack in numbers is compensated thousandfold by my weapons, my mind, my replicated bodies, and eons of experience. The following record serves one purpose alone, that once justice has been brought to UBU, humans in the shining and golden UBU-free future will understand that one person can accomplish through the power of hard science and raw emotion entwined in a perfect and indestructible braid. And while we are at it, you are very welcome. Over the next several hundred years, McLeod worked to secure ownership of Kangastock, Greenland through a Project Beluga civilian front. He evacuated the civilian population from the area, then spent a century constructing a superweapon. With 100 high-yield nuclear weapons, heat amplification runes, a targeting beacon for SCP-DAG, and 5 antimatter gathering pods from SCP-HNM in place, he was finally ready for UBU to manifest again.
The helicopter lurched and rumbled as it made its descent through the Verkhoyansk mountain range. Conditions were harsh, with fierce winds ripping through the valleys. At any point, a blizzard threatened to strike. Just about managing to touch down, Mobile Task Force Lambda 9 was glad to be out of the vehicle, even if it meant stepping into knee-deep snow. There were 8 operatives in total. Early reconnaissance suggested that they were the only people present within a 5-kilometer radius, at least.
That's certainly what they hoped. L9 operatives 1 through 6 all made their way up through the mountain pass, leaving 7 and 8 guarding the chopper. This was a simple reconnaissance mission. They would need to search the bunker for any signs of life, gather intel, and get out, hopefully before the snowstorm hit. All 8 of them were kitted out with the Foundation's Keter-grade cutting-edge anti-psionic plating. The operatives had all been chosen carefully, with L9-1 the leader, being an experienced soldier, serving 11 years in the unit. He had capable psionic powers himself, and approached L9-2, who showed some of the same gifts. All of a sudden, as the group rounded the final pass and caught sight of the facility, both 1 and 2 experienced severe migraines. Battered by the Russian wind, they had no choice but to get to the bunker as fast as possible. It looked relatively unassuming, a small concrete slab sitting amongst the mountains. The 6 of them gathered around on either side of the doors as Number 3 forced his way inside. Following standard breaching maneuvers, the rest of the team followed suit, charging in through the open doorway and immediately tipping forward into an abyss. They all landed hard side by side on the slope, some of them rolling down, clattering against each other, and eventually skidding to a stop. Very gingerly, the group started to get back to their feet and catch their breath, as the wind had been knocked out of all of them. They weren't in a research facility at all. The Soviet concrete walls they'd been expecting, the old computers and the lab equipment were all missing. Instead, they were standing in a void, infinite and white, with no seeming end in any direction. Beneath their feet and curling up above them was an enormous double helix, a rainbow of colors weaving in and out of one another. It was like they had found themselves standing on an enormous strand of DNA. Floating all around them were glowing orbs of light. None of them could tell how near or far these orbs were. They could have been close enough to reach out and touch, or they could have been on the other side of the universe. And slowly, one by one, they noticed the doorway that they had come in through. It was perpendicular to the double helix and floating about 3 meters above their heads. Through it, they could see the snowy Russian mountains, their only chance of escape. 4 murmured something about needing to leave. 1 argued back at him. They had no idea whether that door was real or an illusion. They had no idea if they would even be able to pass through it. Besides, it was 3 meters above their heads and floating out over the void. It was risky. But 4 didn't care much about receiving permission. Taking a few steps back further down the double helix to get a good run-up, he braced himself and sprinted as fast as he could before jumping and reaching for the open doorway. It was as if gravity was suddenly much stronger. As soon as he stepped off the double helix, 4 was wrenched downwards, tumbling and spinning, accelerating faster and faster. He let out a petrified scream that sent the other operatives cowering. There was no bottom, at least not as far as they could see or hear. 4's body just got smaller and smaller, and his screams quieter and quieter for several minutes until the agents couldn't hear him anymore. And yet inside the heads of 1 and 2, the psionic members of the group, that screaming sound only seemed to grow louder. December 25th, 1962. A man walked briskly through the West Berlin train station. He'd shaved his head the night before and trimmed his beard down to a thick mustache. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes and a fedora was tipped forward. He hoped that his limp was convincing as he shuffled his way through the crowds. One advantage of wearing dark sunglasses in the middle of winter was that he could constantly scan the faces of those around him, looking for anybody who looked Russian. His train had been delayed. An hour outside of Berlin, the train had ground to a halt. German police officers had walked the length of the carriages, checking everyone's tickets and passports. It felt like an eternity. The man was too old by this point to attempt to run away. Besides, running through rural Germany in the snow didn't sound like the best plan. So he stuck to his cover story and hoped against hope that the fake passport he bought would be convincing enough. Fortunately for him, the officer checked it. He looked to be about 18 years old. The man doubted that the boy would know a Russian passport if it was signed by Nikita Khrushchev himself. But shuffling through the station, his feeling of unease grew. Russian deserters had been poisoned all around him for the prior 15 years. A number of his own colleagues had mysteriously gone missing after feeling disenfranchised by the Soviet agenda. He was such a high-profile target that there was no way the KGB wasn't actively hunting him down at that very moment. He clutched the briefcase tightly and made his way out of the station. His plan had been to call a taxi, but now the prospect of being alone in an anonymous vehicle with only one other person terrified him. His best protection would be to stay out in the open as much as possible. He would walk to the British embassy, or rather, he'd pretend to limp there. Lambda 9 operatives number 7 and 8 stood by the helicopter shivering. Their team had been missing for hours now, and they could see the blizzard slowly covering the mountain range like a blanket. Before long, it would reach them. If their helicopter got buried by anything more than a couple of inches, all hopes of evacuating back to base would be dashed. As soon as their team had gone through the doors into the facility, all radio contact with them had been cut off. The Foundation had suspected that the bunker would be heavily insulated, but if that were the case, surely one of them would have stepped outside to resume radio contact and report what they had found so far. Then, all of a sudden, 7 went limp. He remained standing, but his head and shoulders slumped forward as if he'd fallen asleep. Perhaps he had been standing out here for too long. 8 was about to rouse him when suddenly 7 started talking. "Hello? 8, can you hear me? It's 1, are you there?" The conversation moved quickly. Somehow 1 had been able to reach out to 7's mind and temporarily take control in order to use him as a mouthpiece to communicate with the Foundation over the radio. This kind of contact would normally have been well beyond what 1 would have been capable of, but he explained that as soon as they had entered the facility, both he and 2 had felt their powers growing immeasurably. The Foundation asked for a situation report, and 1 updated them about what had happened to 4. Trying to escape through the door, he jumped and fell through the abyss. But what was more sickening was that they had seen 4 again. All of a sudden, they had started to hear his screams physically, not psionically, and he had fallen past them just off to their right, almost within touching distance. Having decided that it was too risky to attempt an escape as 4 had done, the group of them made the decision to travel further down into the facility, descending along the helix. For the next 3 hours, 7 is unresponsive. He stands there limp in the snow, hunched forward and not speaking, despite 8 and the Foundation's best attempts to wake him. "Command, we found something. The helix branches off a bit. There's a doorway there. I can see inside. It looks like a lab of some kind. We can walk to it. Hopefully it's a way out." Command sent authorization for them to proceed, and so they did. 1 reported that it appeared that they were back in the real world. The abstract shapes and colors, the infinite void was gone. They were in a Soviet research lab. There was medical equipment everywhere, syringes and jars full of, well, maybe it's best not to know what was in them. As Lambda 9 walked through the facility, checking every corner before rounding out, they felt a profound sense of unease. Surely enough, that feeling was warranted. Rounding the corner, 1 found some human remains. The man appeared to have been a researcher at one point. His brains were now stretched out and stuck to the walls like silly putty. What the hell happened here? Safely on British soil, the man who had defected from the Soviet Union sat in the interview room, chewing his bottom lip. He had spent so much time focusing on how he would escape with his life that he hadn't spared much thought for what he would say once he was on the other side. They had codenamed him Iceman, but he didn't feel particularly cold at that moment. He felt nervous, but he did his best to hide it. "I was a project manager in the Psychotronics division of the main intelligence directorate. I oversaw Project Redline, which was commissioned by Joseph Stalin following the Second World War. And before he knew what he was doing, he told his interviewer everything. Over 20 million Soviets had died during the Second World War. Their death toll eclipsed that of any other country. Iceman had witnessed it all. So when Stalin had come to him with the task of creating an ultra-powerful psychic weapon, something that could convert the entire world population to adopt Marxism-Leninism, the man had his reservations. Activating a device like that could trigger a war even deadlier than either of the two already experienced that century. He was part of GRU Division P, the Russian arm of highly classified experimental research. Conferring with his team, they devised a plan. They would argue they needed absolute secrecy to carry out their work, even away from the watching eyes of the KGB. Rather than create a weapon, they would create a tool for peace. Instead of promoting the values of communism, they would create a psychic tool to dampen humanity's inclination towards violence and aggression. Their method would be brutal but a necessary evil. In short, their theory was the psychic mind is often limited by the human body. A young child could have incredible psychic potential, but their physical limitations would hold them back from exercising it. Therefore, they needed to separate mind from body, and they had just the trick for that: traumatic disassociation. They would take a young, gifted psychic and tear out their mind in order to transfer that mind into the body of a controllable avatar. Iceman explained that none of them could have expected how much fate would look favorably on them. Just 2 years prior, the KGB had captured and brought in a set of triplets for them. The triplets were incredibly rare, conjoined at both the head and the torso, with 3 arms and 6 legs. It was a miracle they were still alive. So Iceman and his team set to work immediately. They dosed the triplets up with as many mind-altering chemicals as they could physically endure, before electrocuting them for prolonged periods, whilst reading anti-violent manifestos to them. It worked. The triplets' minds disassociated, and the Soviets were able to capture it. Iceman was not forthcoming about what they did with the mind or where they transferred it. All he explained was that it worked. They took the weapon to the Norlag Gulag. 50,000 of the most vicious criminals known to man, looters, murderers, psychopaths, dropped their makeshift knives and refused to move an inch, even as we threw the gates of the camp wide open. We did that. The final test was on Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. From thousands of kilometers away, they activated Project Redline and influenced the 2 world leaders at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. War was averted, but Khrushchev was furious. He removed the entire team, killing a number of them, and began to weaponize Project Redline. If they could fire it at an advancing army, they'd never lose a single soldier ever again. To do this, it needed to be stronger. They were to implant the consciousness into another subject, torture them further, and disassociate again, amplifying the psychic abilities. Mobile Task Force Lambda 9 were stuck in the facility. The blizzard had been so strong that 7 and 8 had to return to base the previous night and come back. Having spent a night lost and wandering through the helix, descending deeper and deeper, the team had noticed that the world around them was getting darker. Periodically, they could hear 4 screaming and falling past them once again before dropping out of sight again beneath them. They had tried to catch him, to pull him back, but he was always just out of reach, desperate to be saved. 7 and 8 returned, and their psychic puppet radio contact was resumed with command. The team found another door. Searching through it, they were horrified to find their own corpses floating in the air in front of them, dressed up in lab coats. Just like the scientists from the levels above them, their brains were stretching out and lying together in some kind of web. Yet further down the helix, they found another door. 1 and 3 decided to go inside, leaving the rest of the team standing on the helix, ready to catch 4 if he fell past again. This time, 2 was in contact with command through his psychic link to the men by the chopper. He soon reported hearing 4's screams getting closer and closer. The group stood around, ready to catch him. There he is. I can see him. He's definitely falling towards us. Yeah, I see it too. Command? There's something up with 4. It looks like he's spread-eagled. His arms are stretched out. He's screaming. It's not getting louder. It's getting flatter. There would be no further contact with 2, 5, and 6. By the time 1 and 3 returned from scouting out the room, they were alone. 1 couldn't even sense the presence of any of their squad mates anymore. They had no option but to continue to descend the helix into the darkness. The smell of burning flesh filled their noses. The echoes of death were all around them. Voices cried out in pain and fear. And then, new voices, speaking in Russian, cut over the top.
Stop it. Give in. Don't resist. Resisting is bad. You will be punished if you resist. Begin electrical discharge. 500 volts. 3 amps. Increase voltage every minute.
The operatives had no choice but to listen to the memory of the triplets being tortured. Not just the sounds, but the emotions that flood them. Those weren't someone else's memories anymore. They were becoming their own. And just as they saw into the mind of the triplets saw them in return. Command, it's trying to open me up.
like it did everyone else, but I can see into it. It's learning from us. It knows all about me. The squad, the Foundation, they're almost on me. It's the Conjunction, the scientists, the monsters that made this thing, the ones it knew before it died, was that they wanted it to conjunct. It wants to make us part of it. Don't come back here. It wants to make the whole world part of it. And at that moment, the entirety of Mobile Task Force Lambda 9 dropped dead. In that same moment, a multicolored sphere of energy 5 kilometers wide appeared over the facility, dwarfing the mountains around it, designated SCP-2664-A. For years, the Foundation dropped psionically dampening materials and psionically stumped D-Class personnel into the sphere in hopes of slowing its growth. No other containment measures could be acted upon. That was until 1300 hours on the 25th of December 2000, Christmas Day. SCP-2664-A suddenly fluctuated, releasing an enormous amount of psionic energy that resulted in the brain death of all humans within a 200-kilometer radius. The following day, at 1700 hours, a global occult coalition satellite launched a spherical payload right into the heart of SCP-2664-A. For 13 minutes, tremendous amounts of radiation were detected emanating from inside the sphere, before just as suddenly as it had appeared, SCP-2664-A disappeared entirely, leaving just the payload in its place. Before the Foundation was able to recover the payload, it launched into the atmosphere and was lost. Subsequent reconnaissance operations to the site have confirmed no abnormal radioactive or psionic readings. To all intents and purposes, SCP-2664 appears to be gone. As such, the file has been marked as neutralized. Long may it stay that way. Now check out SCP-4007 Unit 731 and SCP-186 to end all wars.